My name is Nora Doyle. I'm 34 years old. The morning my Uncle Raymond's will was supposed to be read. My mother planted herself in front of the conference room door. She put one hand flat against the wood. She looked at me like she'd already rehearsed this. "Wait in the hall," she said. "This is family business." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I'd heard that sentence in 100 different shapes for 20 years, and I thought I'd finally stopped being surprised by it. I turned toward the elevator. I didn't argue. Arguing only gives people the satisfaction of watching you beg, and I wasn't going to give her that. That was when the lawyer looked up. He was sitting at the far end of the conference table, a folder open in front of him, reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose. He hadn't said a word since I'd walked in. Now he set his pen down. "No," he said. The room went still. My mother's hand slid off the door. "She stays," he said, and he pointed at the one empty chair across from him. My brother Colt looked up from his phone, confused for exactly 1 second. Then he laughed it off, the way he laughed off anything he didn't understand. My father didn't laugh. My father just stared at the table like the wood grain owed him an explanation. I walked back in. I sat down in the chair the lawyer had pointed to. Grant Whitfield, that was his name. I'd met him twice before, both times for less than 5 minutes, both times shaking a hand that felt more like a formality than a relationship. I had no idea, sitting down in that chair, that my uncle had spent the last 18 months of his life making sure I'd end up in it. Whitfield reached into a second folder. He pulled out an envelope, sealed, my uncle's handwriting across the front in block letters. He told us Raymond had given him specific instructions. This envelope did not get opened unless every person named inside that room was present and accounted for. He broke the seal. My brother's smile faded first. Then my mother turned, slowly, toward my father, and my father's face went the color of the folder in front of him. Whatever the three of them had walked into that room expecting to inherit, my uncle had left something else waiting for them first. Proof. Before I tell you what that letter said, and what happened after my family realized I wasn't leaving that building, tell me something. What time is it where you're watching this from? And what part of the country are you in? I want to know how far a story like this travels. My Uncle Raymond built Colby Custom Coach from a single pole barn outside Elkhart, Indiana, into one of the last family-owned RV manufacturers still standing in a town that called itself the RV capital of the world. 40 years. He started by welding frame rails himself. He ended up running a plant with almost 90 employees, shipping custom coaches to dealers in 11 states. My mother, Denise, was his younger sister, and she ran the office side of the business accounts, payroll, purchasing. My father, Walt, had worked the assembly floor for over 30 years and eventually became shop foreman. My brother, Colt, was sales director by the time he was 31. I had never worked a single day at Colby Custom Coach. I did inventory audits for a regional food distributor 2 towns over, and my mother had a way of describing that job that made it sound like something you did while waiting for a real one to come along. The conference room belonged to Whitfield's firm, not to the company, a rented space 2 floors above a bank branch downtown, with a long table, a pitcher of water nobody had touched, and a window that looked out over a parking lot instead of anything worth looking at. My mother had chosen it on purpose, I realized later. Neutral ground made it easier to control who walked through the door. Grant Whitfield waited until I'd sat back down before he said anything else. Only then did I learn that my presence in that room hadn't been optional in the first place. Raymond's instructions were specific, he said, adjusting the folder in front of him. The substantive provisions of his estate could not be read aloud unless Denise, Walt Colt, and Nora Doyle were physically present or had formally waived attendance in writing. My mother made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. "That's absurd. Nora isn't involved with the company." Whitfield looked at her over the top of his glasses, unhurried. Mrs. Doyle, your brother anticipated that objection specifically. Colt let out a short laugh of his own, the kind meant to fill a silence rather than mean anything. Of course he did. Whitfield didn't respond to that either. He broke the seal on the envelope, unfolded 3 typed pages, and began to read. The first sentence wasn't sentimental. It wasn't even addressed to the room. It was addressed to one person in particular. If Nora is sitting in this room only because Grant insisted, then Denise has already confirmed one of the reasons I wrote this letter. Nobody moved. I actually forgot to breathe for a second. Whitfield kept reading. My uncle had written that for years. He'd watched his sister decide who counted and who didn't inside that company, who got credit for a deal that barely broke even, and who got quietly written out of conversations that concerned them directly. He'd watched Colt accept privileges he'd never had to earn twice for, and he'd watched Walt keep the peace by simply never asking the harder question out loud. Then the letter got specific, in a way that made my stomach drop before I understood why. 6 company events, listed with exact dates. A warehouse expansion proposal Raymond had personally rejected 2 years earlier, then found approved anyway under a different internal project code. Reimbursements submitted under a client development budget line that Raymond had frozen himself in writing. 8 months before his death, reimbursements that had gone through regardless. Colt sat forward in his chair. What is this Whitfield didn't stop reading? My uncle had written that 7 months before he died. He had quietly hired an independent forensic accounting firm, without telling a single person in the family. My mother's expression changed instantly, not sadness, not confusion, something colder and faster than either one. What firm, she asked. That information is in the supporting documents, Whitfield said. She turned to my father. Did you know about this? Walt shook his head. Too quickly. The way people do when the honest answer is more complicated than a simple no. Colt pushed his chair back an inch. This is insane. Raymond was sick near the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. Whitfield lowered the pages just enough to look at him directly. Mr. Doyle, I'd advise you not to characterize the testator's mental capacity unless you intend to formally challenge this will. Your uncle's estate file includes 2 independent competency evaluations, both completed at the time these documents were executed. Colt leaned back, whatever he'd been about to say. He swallowed it instead. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, the way I did during an inventory reconciliation when the numbers wouldn't tie out yet, and I knew, before I even found the error, that one was there. It's a specific kind of quiet, waiting for a discrepancy to surface. You don't feel clever in that moment. You feel like the room has been holding its breath longer than you have, and it's finally letting some of it out. Something in this family had never tied out. My uncle had known it for years, and apparently, so had I, without ever putting a name to it. Colt's knee had started bouncing under the table, fast, the way it used to when we were kids, and he'd broken something he thought no one would notice. My mother's face had gone smooth in the particular way it did right before she took control of a room, the same expression she used to wear walking into a client meeting after a bad quarter. My father hadn't moved at all. He was looking at his own hands like he was trying to remember what he'd signed and when. Whitfield turned to the second page, unhurried. The way a man turns a page when he already knows exactly what's coming and has decided not to soften it for anyone in the room. Whatever came next, I understood already that it wasn't going to be about grief. Whitfield read the second page slowly, the way a man reads numbers out loud when he wants everyone in the room to actually hear each one instead of letting them blur together. Raymond had documented 11 separate reimbursements approved under a line called Client Development Outreach, all authorized by my mother, all paid out to my brother over the preceding 2 years. Individually, none of them looked alarming. Together, they added up to just under $31,000. every single one used the same internal project code, a code that, according to my uncle's notes, had originally been assigned to a warehouse safety upgrade that never happened. One entry stood apart from the rest. A repair invoice for Colt's personal truck, $4,200, filed under a customer warranty claim for a vehicle that Colby Custom Coach had never sold. "That's a clerical thing," my mother said, before Whitfield had even finished the sentence. "Purchasing miscodes things constantly. It happens in every business this size." "It happened 11 times," Whitfield said, without looking up. "Using the same misapplied code, over a span of 2 years, all benefiting the same person. Your brother anticipated that argument too, Mrs. Doyle. He wrote several pages addressing exactly how often clerical errors are supposed to happen before they stop being clerical." My mother's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from every argument I'd ever lost to her as a teenager. She didn't have a response ready for that one. It was strange, watching her run out of a script for the first time in my life. Colt finally spoke, and when he did, his voice had the exact tone he used to use on me back when we still shared a bathroom, growing up, the tone that meant he'd already decided I wasn't worth arguing with as an equal. "What exactly do you think you understand about any of this?" he said, turning to look at me directly for the first time since I'd walked back into the room. "Because Raymond let you look at a few spreadsheets on a Sunday afternoon, I could have said a dozen things. I'd spent 20 years learning to swallow most of them. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. I understand that 11 reimbursements under one project code isn't a spreadsheet problem. It's a pattern. And patterns are the only part of my job I've ever actually been good at." He didn't have anything to say back to that. For a second, something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like recognition, like he was seeing, for the first time, that the sister he'd spent his whole life dismissing might have actually been paying attention the entire time he assumed she wasn't. Growing up, Colt had always been the one people described in a single confident sentence. Star of the sales floor before he turned 30, the one Raymond supposedly groomed for bigger things, according to every toast our mother ever gave at a company holiday party. Nobody had ever needed a full sentence to describe me. I was just the quiet one who did something with numbers somewhere else. It used to bother me more than I let on. Sitting in that conference room, it didn't bother me anymore. It just felt like information I'd been given a long time ago, finally confirmed out loud. Whitfield let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. Raymond's letter noted that he'd first flagged the project code pattern to Priya Anand, an independent forensic accountant. 7 months before his death, the same firm mentioned earlier, now named for the record. Priya had been engaged quietly, off the company's regular vendor list, paid directly through Raymond's personal account, so that no one inside Colby Custom Coach would see the retainer show up anywhere routine. Whitfield explained that Priya's engagement letter, her preliminary findings memo, and every invoice she'd submitted were included in a separate binder that would be distributed to each of us at the end of the reading, not before, and not selectively. My uncle, it seemed, had thought through exactly how much information to release and in what order. The same way he used to plan a production schedule down to the hour. My father hadn't said a word through any of this. He sat with his elbows on the table and his hands pressed against his temples, like a man trying to hold a headache in place before it spread. "Walt." My mother's voice, sharper now, aimed sideways at him instead of at me. "Say something." He looked up. "What do you want me to say?" "Denise, that this is insane, that Raymond wasn't in his right mind near the end." Whitfield's pen tapped once against the folder, not loud, just enough to redirect the room's attention back to him. "I'll remind everyone again. The competency evaluations are part of the estate file. I'd advise against building an argument on a foundation the documents already contradict." My father didn't say the thing my mother wanted him to say. He didn't say much of anything. He just looked, for one long moment, like a man watching a bridge he'd driven across for 30 years finally show the crack that had probably always been there. I thought about the Sunday afternoons Colt had just referenced like they were nothing like handing me a stack of purchase orders, and asking me a few questions had been some kind of harmless hobby my uncle indulged in with his overlooked niece. I hadn't understood, sitting across from Raymond at his kitchen table 18 months ago, that he'd been building a case. I understood it now. Whitfield reached for the third page, before he could start reading it. He paused and looked at each of us in turn, the way a man looks at a room before he tells it something it doesn't want to hear. 18 months before that morning, Raymond had started asking me to come by the plant on Sunday afternoons. It began small. He'd call on a Thursday, mention he had some paperwork he wanted a second set of eyes on, ask if I had an hour that weekend. I always said yes. Not because I understood why he was asking me instead of anyone who actually worked there, but because he was the only person in that family who'd ever made time feel like something he wanted to spend on me specifically, rather than something he was obligated to hand over. We'd sit at the small table in the back corner of his office, away from the main floor, with a stack of purchase orders and inventory sheets between us. He'd slide one across and ask a question that sounded almost offhand. "Does this vehicle identification number look right to you?" I'd look. Most of the time, nothing seemed wrong. Occasionally, I'd notice 2 purchase orders referencing the same VIN, weeks apart, for what should have been 2 separate coach frames coming down the line. I'd point it out. Raymond would nod slowly, the way a teacher nods when a student finally finds the answer he already knew was there, and he'd write something down in a small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He never explained what he was writing. I never asked. It felt, at the time, like he simply enjoyed having someone double-check his instincts. Other afternoons, he'd hand me a stack of parts receiving reports next to a line from the assembly floor's installation log. Interior trim kits marked as installed on units that, according to the inventory system, still showed the same trim kits sitting in the warehouse, untouched. Wouldn't the same part get logged twice? By mistake, I asked him once. "Could," he said. Or it never left the warehouse in the first place. And somebody just needed the paperwork to say it did. He didn't look up from his coffee when he said it. He said it the way you'd mention the weather. One Sunday. He walked me through a back room off the main office that I'd never had a reason to see before, a cramped space with an old desk phone system, wires taped along the baseboard. A small reel-to-reel recorder bolted into a metal cabinet that looked older than I was. "What's all this?" I asked. "Line recorder," he said. "Put it in myself, years back, after a supplier tried to claim we'd verbally agreed to a price we never agreed to. Cost me a fortune to prove him wrong, because I had nothing but my word against his. Now, every big order that comes through this line gets recorded. Nobody argues about who promised what over the phone anymore." He tapped the cabinet once, almost fondly. "Company policies posted right there by the switchboard. Everybody who calls this line more than once knows it. Keeps people honest without me having to stand over their shoulder." I hadn't thought about that room again until months later. And even then, I didn't understand yet why he'd bothered showing it to me at all. At the time, it just seemed like one more piece of the plant Raymond took quiet, particular pride in a man who'd rather build a system than have an argument. Those Sunday afternoons became a kind of ritual neither of us ever named out loud. I'd bring coffee from the gas station on the way in, the same order every time. And he'd already have the radio on low in his office, tuned to a station that played nothing but big band recordings from decades before either of us needed to think about estate documents or forensic accountants. He'd ask about my job at the distribution center sometimes. Actually ask, the way nobody else in the family ever bothered to. "What does a discrepancy look like when you find one there? Does anyone ever get upset when you flag something?" I told him the truth. Sometimes people got defensive. Sometimes they thanked me for catching something before it became a bigger problem. He nodded like that second reaction was the only one that mattered. He never once brought Colt into those conversations. And he never once brought my mother into them either. And at the time, I read that as simple discretion, the kind of thing you do when you don't want to stir up family business on a quiet Sunday. It never occurred to me that discretion and strategy could look identical from the outside. He never once told me what any of it added up to. He never said the word audit, or fraud, or investigation. He asked questions the way you'd ask a friend to help you find your car keys. Like the answer mattered, but the stakes were small. Looking back, from that conference room chair 18 months later, I understood it differently. He hadn't been testing his own instincts against mine. He'd been testing whether I saw what he already saw. Whitfield's voice pulled me back into the room. He was noting, for the record, that Raymond had engaged Priya Anand's firm to conduct a full forensic review of these exact discrepancies, the duplicated identifiers, the phantom trim installations beginning 7 months before his death, and that her preliminary findings would be presented in full during a formal governance meeting, the estate required within 10 business days of this reading. My mother's hand had gone very still on the table, the way it did whenever she was calculating something faster than she wanted anyone else in the room to notice. Whitfield set the third page down flat on the table, squared it with the edge like he needed one more second of order before the room lost whatever was left of it. "There's a provision here concerning company ownership," he said. "I want to read it exactly as written, without paraphrasing, because the structure matters." He explained that Raymond had owned 58% of Colby Custom Coach through a holding entity called Colby Family Holdings, built specifically to keep the company's controlling interest inside the family across generations. The remaining shares were split between minority stakes my mother and Colt had each accumulated over the years through standard compensation packages' real ownership. Just never enough, on its own, to control a vote. What Raymond had done with his 58% was different from what any of us expected. He hadn't divided it evenly between his sister and his nephew, the two people who'd spent their whole careers inside that building. He'd placed 55% of the company's voting interest into a newly created oversight trust, effective immediately upon his death, with instructions that it remain in place for a mandatory 12-month independent review period. "The initial trustee," Whitfield said, "the person holding voting authority on behalf of that trust during those 12 months, is Nora Doyle." My mother made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a laugh and something closer to disbelief, sharp enough that Colt actually flinched beside her. "She's never even worked there," she said. "She doesn't know the vendors. She doesn't know the clients. She's never sat through a single board meeting in her life." "That's correct," Whitfield said, entirely unbothered. "The trust doesn't require operational experience. It requires fiduciary responsibility and obligation to act in the company's best interest, under the oversight of an independent review board in this firm, for the duration of the term your brother specified. Nora doesn't gain personal ownership of any additional shares. She can't sell the voting block, dissolve it, or direct it toward any outcome that benefits her financially. She holds it, and she's accountable for how she holds it." "So what exactly can she do with it?" Colt said. And there was something almost pleading underneath the sarcasm, like a man asking a question he already suspected he wouldn't like the answer to. "She can vote it," Whitfield said, "on matters requiring shareholder approval, which, as of this morning, includes any expenditure over $10,000, any new vendor contract, and any change to existing account authorizations, all of which now require sign-off from the trust, in addition to normal management approval." I sat there absorbing that the way I absorbed a discrepancy report at work, not with triumph. Not yet. Just a slow recalculation of what the next 12 months of my life were actually going to require of me. I hadn't asked for this. I understood, even in that first minute, that plenty of people were going to assume I had, because assuming I'd wanted something was easier than admitting my uncle had simply trusted my judgment more than theirs. I thought about my actual job, waiting for me on Monday morning pallets to reconcile, a shipment discrepancy report due by Wednesday. None of it glamorous. All of it mine. Nothing about that life had prepared me to hold voting authority over a company with 90 employees. And yet everything about that life, the small, tedious discipline of checking one number against another until they matched, was apparently exactly what Raymond had been counting on. "This is a joke," Colt said, standing halfway out of his chair before catching himself and sitting back down. "She doesn't even want to run a company. She's never once said she wants to run a company." "Nobody's asking her to run it," Whitfield said. "Management stays in place, subject to the new approval structure. The trust's role is oversight, not operations." My mother turned to look at me directly then, for what felt like the first time that entire morning without the usual mixture of impatience and dismissal on her face. Something more careful had replaced it. She was doing the things she did in every negotiation I'd ever watched her run, recalculating risk in real time, deciding how much of her original position she could still afford to hold. "Nora, honey." Her voice had gone soft in the way it only did when she wanted something. "You don't want this. You have your own job. You don't know our clients, our vendors, the way this business actually runs day to day. Your uncle was grieving Aunt Ruth's passing the year before he wrote this. And grief makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. We can fix this quietly, as a family, without dragging outside accountants and independent boards into something that's ours to handle." There it was. Quietly. The word people reach for exactly when the truth has become inconvenient enough that they need a softer name for making it disappear. "You tried to leave me in the hallway 20 minutes ago," I said. "Why would I trust you to fix anything quietly?" Her jaw tightened, the same motion I'd watched 100 times across 100 smaller arguments. Except this time, there was no ground left underneath it to stand on. "Because I'm your mother," she said. "That didn't make me family at the door," I said. "I don't see why it should now." Whitfield let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he turned to the final section of the letter and told us that Raymond had left specific instructions for a formal governance meeting to be convened within 10 business days, where Priya Anand's full findings would be presented to an independent board for the first time. The meeting broke for what Whitfield called a short recess, though nobody in that room needed to ask why. My mother stepped out to make a phone call she clearly didn't want overheard. Colt followed her, already talking before the door had fully closed behind them. My father stayed seated at the table for a moment, then got up without a word and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot like it might have an answer written on it somewhere. Whitfield waited until it was just the two of us before he spoke again. "I imagine this isn't what you expected walking in here this morning," he said. "I expected to be told to wait in the hall." I said, "So no, not really." He almost smiled at that, the first real expression I'd seen cross his face since I'd sat back down. He reached into his own folder and slid a single photocopied page across the table to me. "My copy of the letter," he explained, along with something Raymond had asked him to attach specifically for me, separate from the formal document, written by hand. I read it twice before I trusted myself to say anything. "Nora, don't use this to punish them. Use it to make it impossible for anyone to keep hiding. There's a difference, and you'll know it when you feel the pull toward the wrong one." He knew I'd be angry, I said, mostly to myself. "He knew all of you would react in the ways you've reacted your whole lives," Whitfield said. "He spent a great deal of time thinking about how each of you would respond to this morning, long before it happened. I don't say that to unsettle you further. I say it because it might help to know none of this is improvised. He built in time for exactly this conversation. And if I don't want it, the trustee role, Then you decline in writing, and the court appoints an independent professional trustee instead. And the review proceeds regardless, just without a family member holding the vote. He paused. For what it's worth, that wasn't a trap he built to force your hand. It was an option he genuinely left open. He simply believed you'd choose the harder one. I didn't answer him right away. Some part of me was still standing in a hallway that no longer existed, waiting to be let back into a room I'd already been sitting in for over an hour. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Did he know my mother might try to keep me out of the room entirely? This morning, before any of this, Whitfield considered the question longer than I expected before answering it. Your uncle amended the attendance clause in this will 3 weeks after his last private meeting with your mother. I wasn't in that meeting, and I don't know what was said in it. But the timing wasn't a coincidence, and he wasn't a man who amended documents on a whim. That was answer enough. I sat with it for a moment, turning it over the way you turn over a part you're not sure will fit until you've checked the specs twice. He also asked me to remind you of one more thing, Whitfield added. If you accepted the role, the trust doesn't expire because things get uncomfortable at home. 12 months means 12 months, regardless of what pressure gets applied in the meantime. He wanted you prepared for that specifically, not just for today. I need to think, I said. You have until the governance meeting to decide formally, he said. Though practically speaking, the trust takes effect immediately regardless. Pending your acceptance or decline, nothing moves without your signature either way. I left his office a little after noon, the photocopied letter folded into my bag, and drove home instead of going anywhere near the plant. I didn't want to see any of them yet. I wanted quiet, and my own kitchen table, and time to read that handwritten note a few more times until it stopped feeling like it belonged to someone else's life. My phone buzzed twice on the drive home. Once from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in over a year, the message just a string of question marks. Once from Colt, no words at all, just a missed call I let go to voicemail without listening to it. I wasn't ready yet to hear whatever tone he'd chosen for that message, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation before I'd had the chance to sit with this myself. That evening, going through a box of things my uncle had left me directly separate from the estate. Just a small crate of odds and ends his attorney had dropped off weeks earlier that I hadn't gotten around to opening. Sitting untouched by my front door since the funeral, I found the spiral notebook. It had been sitting near the bottom, underneath a folded flannel shirt I recognized from every cold morning he'd ever spent walking the assembly floor, and a coffee mug from a diner in Elkhart that had closed down years ago. I recognized it instantly, the same one he'd kept in his shirt pocket every Sunday afternoon, the one he'd write in after I answered one of his offhand questions correctly. I opened it at the kitchen table, under the one working light over the sink, and started reading his handwriting from the first page. Every question he'd ever asked me was in there, dated, in order, the VIN duplicates, the phantom trim installations, questions I hadn't even realized at the time were building toward anything at all. Next to several of my answers, in smaller handwriting, he'd written a single word. Confirmed. I sat there for a long time after that, not crying exactly, just sitting with the particular weight of realizing someone had believed in you long before you'd given yourself any reason to believe in yourself the same way. My mother showed up at my apartment 2 days later without calling first, holding a manila folder against her chest like it was something fragile, instead of something she'd clearly rehearsed on the drive over. "I have a solution," she said, before I'd even fully opened the door. I let her in because turning her away in the hallway of my own building felt like becoming a version of her I didn't want to become, even in a moment that would have been fully justified. She sat down at my kitchen table without being asked, opened the folder, and slid it across to me the way Whitfield had slid the letter across 2 days earlier. Except everything about the gesture felt smaller this time, more transactional. Inside was a proposed agreement, typed up cleanly, clearly drafted by someone with a law degree. I would resign as trustee, effective immediately. In exchange, my mother and father would personally pay me $150,000 once probate closed personally. The document specified twice, not through the company, and Colt would guarantee me a 2% non-voting interest in Colby Custom Coach, permanently, regardless of how the review concluded. I read it twice, then I looked up at her. The apartment felt smaller with her sitting in it. It always did, even when I was a kid, like her presence recalibrated the size of every room she walked into, made it about her scale of things instead of mine. My kitchen table had exactly 2 chairs. She'd taken the one I usually sat in without seeming to notice she'd done it. "You're offering to buy Raymond's decision away from me. I'm trying to protect 90 employees from months of chaos," she said, her voice dropping into the register she used for company all-hands meetings, calm and reasonable and utterly certain of its own reasonableness. A 12-month independent review, board oversight, outside accountants combing through every vendor file. Do you have any idea what that does to morale? To client confidence? People leave over less than that. Then why is the payment coming from you and Dad personally? I asked. Instead of from the company. If this is really about protecting the company? She paused for just a fraction of a second too long before answering. Because this is a family matter. We handle family matters as a family. You tried to leave me in a hallway 4 days ago, I said. I'm having a hard time understanding when exactly I became family again. Something flickered across her face. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Don't get arrogant about this. Nora, Raymond gave you temporary authority. That's not the same thing as competence. You don't know what you're stepping into. That one landed differently than she probably expected it to. A year earlier, I might have spent the rest of the conversation trying to prove her wrong, listing my qualifications, defending myself the way I'd spent 20 years defending myself in that family, quietly and always a little too late. Instead, I just slid the folder back across the table toward her. Then you shouldn't have anything to worry about from an independent review, I said. If everything's as clean as you're saying, the accountants will confirm it, and this will all be over in 12 months exactly the way you want it to be. She stood up slowly, folder back in hand, and walked toward my door. She stopped there with her hand on the frame, not quite looking at me. Colt has relationships in this industry you don't understand, she said. Suppliers, dealers, people who've worked with him for a decade. If his name gets dragged through some public review process, the damage doesn't stop at him. It costs jobs. Real people's jobs. Nora, not abstractions. Maybe his reputation should depend on what he actually did, I said, instead of on how quietly the rest of us are willing to protect him from it. She stared at me for a few seconds longer than felt comfortable, like she was looking at a stranger wearing her daughter's face. You've changed, she said finally. No, I said. I think I've just finally reached the part of me that knows how to say no. It was always there. You just never had to deal with it before now. She left without saying anything else. I stood at the window and watched her walk to her car in the parking lot below, folder still tucked against her chest. And I noticed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that watching her walk away didn't leave the familiar ache behind it that it always used to. It left something quieter instead, something closer to relief and something closer to grief, arriving at exactly the same time, for exactly the same reason. I sat back down at the table after she'd gone and looked at the 2 empty chairs for a while. Somewhere in the last 4 days, I'd stopped waiting for her to see me the way I'd spent my whole life waiting for it, and I hadn't even noticed the exact moment it happened. It didn't feel like victory. It felt more like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long that my arms had simply forgotten how light I could feel without it. I called Priya's office the next morning and asked for a copy of everything filed so far. I wanted to start reading before the governance meeting, not after it. Priya Anand called me on a Thursday morning, while I was still at my own job, standing in the middle of a receiving dock counting pallets of canned goods against a manifest that didn't quite match. I stepped outside to take the call, my breath fogging a little in the cold, phone pressed hard against my ear over the noise of a forklift backing up somewhere behind me. "I want to ask you something directly," she said, "and I need an honest answer, not a polite one." "Okay. Has anyone approached you about destroying, revising, or removing any company records related to the review? Anything at all? A conversation that felt casual, a suggestion that something might be easier to just clean up before the meeting?" I thought about my mother sitting at my kitchen table 3 days earlier, folder in hand, the word quietly doing its careful work in the middle of her sentence. "Nobody's asked me to destroy anything," I said. "My mother offered me money to resign as trustee. That's the closest thing to a request I've gotten." "That's useful to know, but it's not quite what I'm asking." Priya's voice stayed level, professional, the voice of someone who'd clearly had this exact conversation with other people before, in other companies, under other names. "I'm asking because someone accessed a set of archived purchasing records late Tuesday night, outside normal business hours, using an administrative login that hasn't been used in over a year. I'm not accusing anyone specific yet. I'm telling you because, as trustee, you're entitled to know when something like that happens, and because it tells me the timeline on this review just changed." Something cold settled low in my stomach. A feeling I recognized from work, the specific dread of realizing a discrepancy wasn't a one-time mistake, but the visible edge of something larger still hidden underneath it. I'd felt that same drop in my stomach exactly twice before in my career, both times right before a much bigger problem surfaced than the one I'd originally gone looking for. The first time, a supplier had been quietly substituting a cheaper component into a food-safe packaging line for months before anyone caught it. The second time, an employee had been adjusting shipment counts by a few units at a time, small enough never to trigger an automatic flag, large enough to add up to real money by the end of a fiscal year. In both cases, the person doing it had been careful. Careful people don't make one mistake. They make a pattern of small, deliberate ones, spaced out just far enough apart to avoid drawing a straight line between them. Changed? It means whoever accessed those records is worried about what's in them, she said. People don't dust off old administrative logins at 11 at night out of nostalgia. I'd like to move the formal governance meeting up if possible, rather than wait out the full 10-day window your uncle's instructions allow. I told her I'd defer to Whitfield on the legal timeline, but that as far as I was concerned, sooner sounded exactly right. We hung up a few minutes later with a plan already forming. Whitfield would confirm a date within the next 2 days, and Priya would have her preliminary findings ready to present regardless of exactly when the room finally filled. Before she let me go, Priya added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, though I don't think anything she said to me over the following 12 months was ever really an afterthought. "Keep your own copies of anything you're given going forward," she said. "Emails, documents, anything. Not because I doubt Grant's office, because paper has a way of disappearing exactly when people need it to, and I'd rather you never find yourself needing something you can't produce." The meeting ended up being set for 9 days out, the earliest Whitfield could get every required party, including outside counsel for both my mother and Colt, into the same room with proper notice. The location surprised me a little when I heard it. Not Raymond's house, where every major family conversation of my childhood had technically happened even when it didn't need to. Not the conference room downtown either, where the will had been read. The training room at the plant itself, a windowless space usually reserved for new hire orientation and forklift certification, chosen specifically, Whitfield told me, because it belonged to nobody's home turf and nobody's personal history. Fluorescent lights, a folding table, A projector bolted to the ceiling that had probably shown safety videos to 100 new employees over the years, and was about to show something considerably less routine. I went back inside and finished counting my pallets. The discrepancy on my own manifest turned out to be a scanning error. Nothing more. Resolved in about 10 minutes once I found it. I remember thinking, on the drive home that evening, how strange it was that the smallest, most solvable problem of my entire week had happened at my actual job, and the largest one was still 9 days away, waiting for me in a room with fluorescent lights and nobody's history to hide behind. I spent most of that drive thinking about who still had that old administrative login memorized well enough to use it at 11 at night without help. It wasn't the kind of detail you kept lying around by accident. Somebody had held on to it, on purpose, for exactly this kind of moment. I didn't say Colt's name out loud in my own car, not yet, but I noticed I also didn't have to work very hard to think of anyone else it might have been. The training room at Colby Custom Coach smelled like the same industrial carpet cleaner it always had. Underneath, a faint layer of cut metal and fresh paint drifting in from the plant floor beyond the wall. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. Someone had wheeled in extra folding chairs for the occasion, arranged in a loose semicircle facing a pull-down screen that usually displayed forklift safety diagrams to a room full of nervous new hires. I sat near the front, between Whitfield and an empty chair reserved for Priya, who was setting up her laptop at a small table beside the projector. My mother arrived with her own attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Carol Reyes, who spent the first several minutes of the meeting reviewing a stack of papers without once making eye contact with anyone else in the room. My father sat 2 seats down from my mother instead of directly beside her, which I noticed, and which I suspected he noticed me noticing. Colt arrived last, 4 minutes late, dropping into a chair with the loose, unbothered posture of a man who still believed the worst thing that could happen to him today was mild embarrassment. 3 independent board members sat along the far wall, people Raymond had recruited over the years, specifically because none of them owed their livelihood to the family directly. A retired regional bank executive, a manufacturing consultant who'd worked with 2 other Elkhart RV companies, a woman named Dr. Patel, who taught business ethics at a university an hour away, and had apparently agreed to serve on Raymond's board purely, as she put it when she introduced herself, because he'd asked her a genuinely interesting question about fiduciary duty at a dinner party once, and she'd wanted to see how it played out in practice. Whitfield opened the meeting with a short statement establishing procedure. This was a preliminary governance session, not a courtroom. Findings presented today would be reviewed further before any final action, and every party present had the right to respond to specific allegations through counsel. It sounded, to my ear, like a man laying careful groundwork so that nothing said in that fluorescent-lit room could later be dismissed as improperly conducted. Raymond had thought of that too, apparently, the same way he'd thought of everything else. Priya began without much preamble. She pulled up a slide showing 11 reimbursement entries side by side, each one dated, each one tagged with the same misapplied project code originally assigned to a warehouse safety upgrade that internal records showed had never actually been completed. These 11 entries, she said, totaling $31,000 over roughly 2 years, were each approved by Denise Doyle, in her capacity as office manager, under a budget line intended for external client development. In each case, the underlying expense either lacked a corresponding client meeting on record, or, in one instance, she clicked to the next slide. The truck repair invoice, enlarged on the screen, corresponded to a personal vehicle repair filed under a customer warranty claim for a unit the company has no record of ever selling. Carol Reyes spoke up immediately. My client exercised standard executive discretion in categorizing routine business expenses. Discretion of this kind falls well within the normal operating latitude of an office manager position. Some of it may, Priya said, unbothered. I'd invite the board to review whether 11 instances, all sharing one misapplied code, all benefiting one individual over a 2-year span, still reads as ordinary discretion once you look at the pattern rather than any single entry in isolation. Dr. Patel asked the only question that seemed to matter in that moment. Mrs. Doyle, did you flag any of these entries internally, to anyone, at any point, as unusual or requiring further review? My mother's attorney answered before my mother could. My client isn't required to flag her own routine approvals for secondary review. That's precisely what an internal audit function would exist to catch, had one existed at the time. One did exist, Priya said quietly. Raymond Colby existed, and he caught it himself, without any help from the finance department that was supposed to catch it first. Nobody had a response to that. The room sat with the silence for a moment before Dr. Patel turned to her fellow board members, conferred briefly in low voices, and then addressed the room directly. Pending the outcome of the full 12-month review, she said, the board is imposing an immediate restriction. Denise Doyle's approval authority over any expenditure is suspended above the sum of $2,000, effective today, with all such transactions requiring trust sign-off until further notice. My mother didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. Exactly. She looked like a woman recalculating, again, how much ground she still had left to give up before the math finally stopped working in her favor. Colt, for his part, hadn't said a single word through the entire presentation. He'd spent most of it studying his phone, occasionally glancing up at the screen with an expression that read less like concern and more like a man watching a problem that belonged to someone else entirely. It occurred to me, watching him, that he genuinely believed none of this touched him yet. I remember thinking, almost gently, that he had no idea how wrong he was about that, and that the next several weeks were going to be considerably harder on him than this first afternoon had been on my mother. Whitfield closed the session by confirming that Priya's team would continue their review into vendor relationships managed under the sales division, with a follow-up session scheduled once those findings were ready. He didn't look at Colt when he said it. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood exactly whose files were coming next. Word travels fast in a family that's spent decades pretending it doesn't gossip about itself. By the following weekend, I'd gotten calls from 2 aunts, a cousin I hadn't spoken to since a wedding 3 years earlier, and a family friend who'd known Raymond since they were both young men working the floor at a different plant entirely. Each conversation followed roughly the same shape. Concern, offered up front, wrapped around a question that wasn't really a question. Is it true you're trying to take over the company? Your mother says you brought in outside people to go through everyone's records. Don't you think that's a little much? Given everything the family's already going through, I told each of them the same thing. As calmly as I could manage, I hadn't taken over anything. A court-supervised review was underway, required by my uncle's own instructions, and I wasn't at liberty to discuss details that were still confidential. Most of them accepted that answer with the kind of polite skepticism people reserve for an explanation they've already decided not to believe. Colt, I learned secondhand, had been considerably less careful with his own version of events. A longtime sales associate named Frank, who'd worked alongside Colt for nearly a decade and who I'd always liked without ever getting to know well, called me directly to say he'd heard from 2 separate colleagues that I was trying to gut the company and cash out before the ink on Raymond's will was even dry. I asked Frank, as evenly as I could, which specific meeting had been public enough for that kind of detail to leak out. He couldn't answer me, because it hadn't been public. Every session so far had been confidential, restricted to named parties and counsel. Someone had chosen to make it public anyway, and it wasn't hard to guess who benefited most from being the one who got to tell that story first. An uncle on my father's side, a well-meaning man who'd never once involved himself in company matters in his life, called specifically to tell me not to embarrass my brother publicly, whatever else I decided to do, I asked him which part of any of this had been public so far. He didn't have an answer for that either. The governance meeting had happened behind closed doors, attended only by required parties. Colt was the one telling this story to anyone who'd listen, and somehow, in the retelling, I'd become the villain who'd started it. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from defending yourself against something you never actually did, over and over, to people who've already made up their minds before they dialed your number. It's different from the exhaustion of an argument you might still win. This felt more like standing very still while a wave passed over you, trusting that the ground underneath would still be there once the water receded, even though you couldn't see it while you were standing in the middle of it. I didn't correct any of them out loud. Beyond the basic facts I was legally permitted to share. Raymond's letter had asked me to make it impossible for anyone to keep hiding, not to win an argument in the court of family opinion, and those two goals didn't always point in the same direction. Sometimes doing the quieter, harder thing meant absorbing a version of the story you knew wasn't true, at least for a while, because correcting it required revealing things that weren't yours to reveal yet. My father called on a Tuesday evening, later than he usually called, his voice carrying a hesitation I wasn't used to hearing from him. He didn't want to talk on the phone. He said, "Could I come by the plant sometime this week, after hours, when it was quiet?" There was something he wanted to say to me, and he wanted to say it somewhere that felt like it belonged to both of us instead of somewhere that belonged only to my mother's version of how our family was supposed to work. I told him I could come Thursday. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause long enough that I almost asked if he was still there, "I should have called you sooner than this, Nora, about a lot of things, not just this week." He hung up before I could ask him what he meant by that. I sat with the question for the rest of that evening, turning it over the way I'd turned over Raymond's notebook a few weeks earlier, waiting to understand what it was actually telling me. My father wasn't a man who called to make small talk, and he definitely wasn't a man who apologized in advance for a conversation that hadn't happened yet. In 34 years, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd said something to me that sounded like the beginning of an apology rather than the end of one he'd already decided not to finish. Whatever he wanted to say on Thursday, I understood, without him telling me that it had been sitting in him for a long time before that phone call, waiting for the exact kind of quiet he'd asked me to meet him in. I spent the next 2 evenings going through the binder Priya's office had sent over, the one containing her preliminary findings on the reimbursement pattern, reading it slowly at my kitchen table with a highlighter I hadn't used since college. It wasn't required reading for me yet. Not officially. I did it anyway. If I was going to hold a vote on behalf of a company I'd never worked inside, I intended to at least understand, in detail, exactly what that vote was protecting. Thursday evening. The plant was almost empty by the time I arrived. Second shift had wrapped up an hour earlier, and the parking lot held only a handful of cars. My father's truck among them, parked in the same spot he'd parked in for as long as I could remember. Close to the side entrance nobody but longtime employees ever used. He was waiting for me just inside, under a single bank of lights someone had left on over the main assembly line. Half-finished coach frames stood in rows down the length of the building, steel skeletons waiting for walls and windows, and the small, careful details that would eventually turn them into something a family could drive across the country. I'd always liked the plant at this particular stage of quiet, when the machinery wasn't running and you could hear your own footsteps against the concrete. "Thanks for coming," he said. He didn't hug me, which wasn't unusual for him, but he stood close enough that the gesture felt intended anyway. We walked slowly along the line while he talked, the way he used to walk me through the plant when I was maybe 10 years old, pointing out which section built the frame, which section handled electrical, which section fitted the cabinetry that made each coach feel like somebody's actual home, rather than just a vehicle. He'd loved this building longer than he'd loved almost anything else in his life, I think. And it showed in the way he touched the edge of a workbench as we passed it, absent-minded, like greeting an old friend. "I've known things weren't right for a long time," he said finally, stopping near the paint booth, the one part of the plant that always smelled faintly of solvent no matter how well it was ventilated. "Not the specifics. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't know the numbers the way Raymond apparently did, or the way you're learning them now. But I knew your mother handled things her own way, and I knew asking too many questions about how she handled them never seemed to end well for the person asking." "So you didn't ask," I said. It wasn't an accusation. It came out quieter than that. More like a fact we were confirming together. He nodded slowly, and for a moment he looked older than I usually let myself notice. The kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad week, but from 30 years of choosing the same small surrender over and over until it stopped feeling like a choice at all. "Your mother's always been better than me at deciding what needed deciding," he said. I told myself that made me easygoing. Lately I've started wondering if it just made me convenient. "So I didn't ask," he agreed. "For 30 years, I told myself that not asking was the same thing as keeping the peace. I'm not sure I believe that anymore." We stood there for a while without saying much else, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling because it's already doing the work quietly on its own. I thought about all the family dinners where he'd sat 2 seats away from every argument, present, but somehow never quite in it, and I understood. Maybe for the first time, that his silence hadn't been indifference. It had been its own kind of exhausted strategy, one he'd finally stopped believing in. "I'm proud of you," he said, eventually, not looking at me directly, looking instead at the row of half-built coaches stretching down the line. I don't know if I've said that enough over the years. I'm saying it now. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer that right away. So I just nodded, and we kept walking, past the section of the floor where the interior trim kits got fitted, past a bin of leftover cabinet hardware nobody had bothered to sort in years, out toward the door where the night air was already turning cold. It was almost at the door, as we were leaving, that he said the thing that stopped me cold. "Whatever happens with the sales side," he said, mostly to himself, reaching for his keys, "I hope to God Ridgeline trim supply doesn't turn out to be as bad as I think it might be." I asked him what Ridgeline was. He looked at me for a second like he'd said more than he meant to, then waved it off, told me it was nothing, just a vendor name he'd heard around the office. Probably didn't mean anything at all. He said goodnight quickly after that, got into his truck, and pulled out of the lot before I'd even reached my own car. I stood there a moment in the empty parking lot, turning the name over, Ridgeline Trim Supply. I'd never heard it before in my life. But I knew the particular shape of my father's face when he was trying to unsay something. And I understood, driving home that night, that whatever I'd just stumbled onto wasn't nothing at all. I thought, on the drive home, about how strange it was that the most honest conversation I'd had with my father in years had ended with him accidentally handing me the next piece of a puzzle he hadn't meant to mention at all. Maybe that was the truest version of him underneath everything a man who wanted, finally, to stop being convenient. Even if some part of him hadn't quite worked out yet how to do that on purpose instead of by accident. I made a note of the name the second I got home. In a plain notebook of my own this time, not Raymond's, and underlined it twice. By the time I fell asleep that night, I'd stopped thinking of my mother's case as the whole story. 11 misfiled reimbursements and 1 truck repair were real, and they mattered. And they'd already cost her the easy authority she'd spent decades assuming was permanent. But $31,000, spread out over 2 years, wasn't the kind of number that kept an independent forensic accountant working for 7 months straight. And it wasn't the kind of number that made a dying man build a 12-month oversight structure around an entire company. Something larger was moving underneath all of it, quietly, the way the real problem always sits underneath the first small discrepancy you happen to notice. My father had handed me a name without meaning to, and I intended to find out exactly what that name was worth before anyone had the chance to make it disappear. Ridgeline Trim Supply. I said it out loud once, alone in my kitchen, just to hear how unfamiliar it sounded. It wouldn't stay unfamiliar for long. Whatever my mother had touched with her own 2 hands, carelessly, almost casually. My brother's part of this story was starting to look like something built on purpose. Brick by brick, over a much longer stretch of time. I called Priya the morning after my father let Ridgeline's name slip in that empty parking lot. And I told her exactly what he'd said and how he'd said it. She didn't react the way I expected. She didn't sound surprised at all. "We flagged that vendor 2 weeks ago," she said. "I wasn't ready to bring it to you yet because I didn't have enough to say anything concrete. Now I have a little more. She asked me to come by her office that afternoon instead of discussing it over the phone. And I left work early to do it. Something I'd never once done in 6 years at the food distribution center. Not even for a family emergency." Priya's office was a converted storefront downtown. 3 desks and a wall of filing cabinets and 2 large monitors angled so that whoever sat across from her could see exactly what she was looking at, which struck me as a deliberate choice for a woman in her line of work. "Ridgeline Trim Supply," she said, pulling up a folder on the screen, "has been invoicing Colby Custom Coach for interior trim components, cabinet hardware, upholstery fasteners, decorative paneling accents for just over 3 years now. Steady work, on paper, regular monthly invoices, reasonable unit prices individually." She clicked through several of them, each one looking, at a glance, entirely unremarkable. "The problem isn't any single invoice. It's what happens when you line all of them up." She pulled up a spreadsheet next, rows and rows of entries, dates highlighted in yellow along one column. 19 of these invoices describe deliveries on dates when our production schedule shows no matching unit in assembly that would have required those specific components. Another set uses descriptions copied almost word for word from earlier invoices, down to identical typos, which tells me somebody was working quickly and reusing a template rather than describing a new delivery each time. "How much total?" I asked, already bracing for whatever number came next. $214,750, Priya said. "Paid out to Ridgeline over the 3-year period, all authorized under Colt's sales division budget, since trim procurement for custom orders falls under his approval authority rather than general purchasing." Priya turned the second monitor toward me and walked through 3 of the flagged invoices line by line, showing me the identical phrasing she'd mentioned. "Assorted trim hardware per prior arrangement," appeared verbatim on 4 separate invoices spanning 8 months, each one billed at almost exactly the same amount despite supposedly covering different units with different specifications. In my own line of work, that kind of repetition would have been the first thing I flagged in an audit. The sort of detail that looks like nothing until you've seen enough real variation to know what it should look like instead. I sat with that number for a moment. It dwarfed my mother's $31,000 so completely that it barely felt like the same kind of problem anymore. Hers had looked, even at its worst, like favoritism dressed up as bad bookkeeping. This looked like something built with intention, sustained across years, hidden well enough that nobody outside a dedicated forensic review would ever have reason to go looking for it. "Who runs Ridgeline?" I asked. "Officially, a man named Dwayne Pratt is listed as the registered manager of the LLC," Priya said. "I haven't confirmed a personal connection to your brother yet. I want to be careful about that particular word, connection, until I actually have something concrete enough to justify using it. Right now what I have is a pattern, a dollar figure, and a name I don't recognize from anywhere else in the company's vendor history before 3 years ago." "I recognize it," I said slowly, memory surfacing from somewhere I hadn't expected it to. "Dwayne Pratt. He and Colt were roommates in college. I met him twice, maybe at family things, years ago." Priya didn't write anything down immediately. She just looked at me for a moment. The particular look of someone recalibrating how much weight a new piece of information deserved before committing it to a file. "That's useful," she said finally. That's very useful. I'd like you to write down everything you remember about him. Dates, context, anything at all, and send it to me today while it's still fresh. I'll take it from there through proper channels. I don't want you doing any digging on your own outside of what you're telling me right now, not because I doubt your judgment, but because anything you find informally could complicate how it's used later. I promised her I wouldn't go looking on my own. And I meant it when I said it, even though some part of me, driving home that evening, already knew how hard that promise was going to be to keep once I had a name and a dollar figure that large sitting in my head. Unresolved. I did keep my promise, mostly. I wrote down everything I remembered about Dwayne Pratt that night, the way he and Colt used to talk over each other, finishing the same joke at holiday dinners. The fact that he'd stood up at Colt's wedding. The vague sense I'd always had that wherever Colt went, Dwayne wasn't far behind him, close enough to be family without ever quite being family. I sent the notes to Priya before midnight and made myself close the laptop afterward instead of searching his name myself. It was harder than it should have been. Some part of me wanted to be the one who found the answer, the way Raymond had once wanted me to be. I reminded myself that this wasn't about who found what first. It was about making sure whatever we found actually held up. I told myself I wasn't investigating anything. I told myself I was simply organizing my own thoughts, at my own kitchen table, using my own uncle's notebook, which technically belonged to me now regardless of what any ongoing review required. That distinction mattered to me more than it probably should have, given how thin it actually was. I laid the notebook open next to the printed summary Priya had allowed me to keep of the flagged ridgeline invoices, nothing confidential, just the dates and the general categories. Enough to work with without crossing any line she'd asked me not to cross. I started matching timestamps. The first match took me almost an hour to notice, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. One of the duplicated VIN references Raymond had written down 18 months earlier, 2 purchase orders, 3 weeks apart, referencing the same vehicle identification number for what should have been separate coach frames, lined up almost exactly with a date range where Ridgeline had billed for assorted trim hardware on a unit that, according to Priya's notes, showed no matching frame moving through final assembly that month. I sat back in my chair, feeling something settle into place the way an inventory reconciliation finally settles once you find the one transposed digit that's been throwing off an entire month's numbers. There's a specific quiet satisfaction in that moment at work. The small private click of a puzzle piece finding its edge. And I felt it now too. Except underneath it sat something heavier. Something closer to grief for the version of my family I'd apparently never actually had. The one where a discrepancy like this would have been unthinkable rather than simply well hidden. I thought about all the times over the years I'd caught myself explaining away a small inconsistency in this family as nothing, a comment that didn't quite add up, a story that shifted slightly in the retelling, a silence that lasted a beat too long after a particular question. I'd trained myself, the way most people do, to smooth those moments over rather than sit with them. Raymond, apparently, had trained himself to do the opposite. Raymond hadn't been asking me abstract questions on those Sunday afternoons. He'd been walking me, one small piece at a time, directly toward exactly this. The duplicated VIN wasn't a data entry error. It was a coach frame that existed on paper twice, so that trim components billed against the phantom copy could be paid for without ever needing to correspond to anything real. I found a second match 20 minutes later. A parts receiving report Raymond had shown me, trim kits marked installed while warehouse inventory counts stayed unchanged. Corresponded almost exactly to another Ridgeline invoice date, another cluster of prior arrangement language, another gap between what the paperwork claimed and what the warehouse floor actually held. My hands were less steady than I wanted them to be by the time I called Priya back. Later than I probably should have called anyone. Though she picked up on the second ring anyway. "I think I found something," I said. "But I want to be clear. I wasn't looking for it exactly. I was just going through my uncle's notebook. I explained the 2 matches, reading her the dates directly from the page in front of me. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of someone doing rapid math in their head. "Those align with 2 of our flagged entries almost exactly," she said finally. "I want copies of those specific notebook pages. Formally, through Grant's office. So this becomes part of the documented record, rather than something you told me over the phone at 10 at night. Can you have them scanned and sent to Grant first thing tomorrow?" I told her I could. "Nora." Her voice softened slightly, just for a moment, dropping the careful professional register she usually kept even in casual conversation. "Your uncle built you a very specific kind of proof here. Not accusations, just documented instinct, confirmed later by someone else's evidence. That's rare. Most people who suspect something this early never bother writing it down in a way that survives long enough to matter." I didn't say anything back right away. I was thinking about a man at a kitchen table asking me offhand questions about vehicle identification numbers, taking my answers seriously enough to write them down and date them. 18 months before either of us understood what any of it would eventually be used to prove. "Can I ask you something else?" I said finally. "Do you think he knew it would take this long, that it would take dying? And a will reading, and a stranger like you?" Before any of this actually surfaced, Priya considered the question with the same care she gave everything else. "I think he knew families protect their own patterns longer than any outsider would," she said. "I think that's exactly why he built a structure that didn't depend on any of you trusting each other. It only had to depend on the paperwork being real." Before we hung up, Priya told me the next step would require an outside voice, someone with first-hand knowledge of how Ridgeline actually operated, ideally someone with no reason left to protect Colt's version of events. She said she already had a name in mind, someone Ridgeline itself had apparently replaced not long after the account started growing, and that she intended to reach out within the week. My mother hosted Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, the way she always did, as though a governance review and a suspended approval authority hadn't changed anything at all about how our family was supposed to present itself to the extended relatives she'd invited. 2 aunts, an uncle, a handful of cousins, all of them seated around the same dining table where I'd spent 34 years learning exactly where I ranked in the conversation. Colt arrived with his usual energy, loud enough to fill a room before he'd even taken his coat off, already telling someone near the door about a client dinner that had apparently gone well the week before. I waited until the meal was mostly finished, coffee poured, dessert plate still sitting half-eaten, before I asked him the question I'd been carrying since my father's slip in the parking lot. "Can I ask you about Ridgeline Trim Supply?" The table didn't go silent exactly, but something in the air shifted, the particular tightening that happens when a question lands somewhere it wasn't expected to land. Colt set down his coffee cup with more care than the gesture required. "What about it?" he said. "How long have you been working with them?" "A few years. Good vendor, reliable, fair pricing, easy to work with on rush orders." He said it smoothly, the tone he probably used on actual clients, and for a second I almost believed the performance of it. "Why the sudden interest in procurement? Nora, last I checked, that wasn't exactly your department." A cousin across the table laughed, not unkindly, more out of nervous instinct than anything else. I felt my face warm, the old reflex to shrink rising up out of habit before I'd consciously decided to let it. That reflex had a long history at that particular table. I could remember being maybe 9 years old, asking a perfectly reasonable question about why Colt got to stay up later than me on a school night, and watching the whole table treat the question itself as the problem rather than the actual unfairness underneath it. Some patterns, I was starting to understand, had been laid down so early in a family that everyone stopped noticing they were patterns at all. "I'm the trustee," I said instead, evenly. "It's a little bit my department now. Whether either of us finds that funny?" "Clipboard Nora, running an audit at Sunday dinner." He smiled when he said it, glancing around the table for the laugh he expected, and got a smaller version of it than he seemed to want. Relax, it's a trim supplier. It's not exactly a mystery. Then you won't mind me looking a little closer, I said. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. The same look I'd seen cross his face once already in that conference room downtown. He recovered quickly, reached for his coffee again, changed the subject to a client dinner story that nobody had asked him to finish. My mother steered the conversation toward a cousin's upcoming wedding a moment later, visibly relieved to have somewhere else to point the room's attention. I caught my father's eye across the table for just a second. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Something in the careful blankness of his expression told me he was thinking about the same parking lot conversation I was. And I wondered, watching him look down at his plate a beat too quickly. How many other small warnings like that one were still sitting in him, unspoken, waiting for the right empty room to finally come out. Later, helping clear plates in the kitchen, my mother found a moment alone with me at the sink. Was that necessary, she asked, voice low enough that it wouldn't carry back to the dining room. In front of everyone. He brought up the nickname, not me, I said. I just asked an honest question. You embarrassed your brother at a family dinner. He's been embarrassing me at family dinners since I was 6 years old, I said. I think we'll survive one afternoon of it going the other direction. My mother didn't have an answer ready for that, and for once, I didn't feel any need to fill the silence for her. She didn't have a response to that, which was, in its own way, more of an answer than anything she could have said out loud. I dried the last plate, set it in the cabinet, and told her I needed to head home before it got too late. I didn't mention Priya. I didn't mention the notebook, or the matching dates, or the $214,000 sitting in a folder on a desk downtown, waiting for its own moment to surface in a room considerably less forgiving than her dining table. Driving home. I thought about the exact word Colt had reached for without hesitation clipboard, said lightly enough that anyone at that table who wanted to could pretend it was affectionate. It wasn't the first time he'd used a version of it, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about hearing it out loud in front of relatives who'd known me my whole life, rather than just between the two of us, made it land differently. It wasn't really about a clipboard, and it never had been. It was about deciding, early and permanently, which sibling got to be taken seriously, and making sure the other one absorbed that decision quietly enough never to challenge it out loud. I'd absorbed it for a very long time. I wasn't especially interested in absorbing it for very much longer. My mother called 2 days after that dinner, her voice carrying the particular calm she used when she'd decided in advance exactly how a conversation needed to go. I want to talk to you about Colt, she said. Without an audience this time, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near her house rather than at either of our homes. Neutral ground the way Whitfield's conference room had been neutral ground, though I doubt she thought of it in quite those terms. She was already seated when I arrived, 2 cups on the table. Mine ordered the way I'd taken my coffee since college, which surprised me more than it probably should have. Ridgeline is a good vendor, she said, before I'd even sat down fully. Colt's built that relationship over years. Whatever this review turns up, I need you to understand it's not going to be what you think it is. What do you think it is? I asked. She hesitated, just slightly, in a way I wasn't used to seeing from her. Business relationships get complicated. Prices get negotiated in ways that don't always look clean on paper. That doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. Have you seen the invoices? Mom. The actual paperwork. Not a summary Colt gave you. The invoices themselves. I don't need to see invoices to know my son wouldn't steal from his own family's company. That's not what I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, a crack I hadn't expected to see. No, she said finally, quieter than before. I haven't gone through the specific invoices myself. Colt handles vendor relationships on the sales side. That's always been his area, not mine. The coffee shop was mostly empty at that hour. Just an older man reading a newspaper near the window, and a barista wiping down the espresso machine. And the quiet of the place made the admission land harder than it might have somewhere busier. My mother had built an entire career on knowing exactly where every dollar in that company went. Watching her admit, however small the admission, that one entire category of dollars had simply been left to someone else's discretion, told me something about her that I'd never once considered in 34 years of watching her run rooms like she owned the air in them. It was the first genuinely honest thing she'd said to me since the will reading, and I sat with it longer than I expected to. For years, I'd assumed my mother knew everything that happened inside that company, that her control extended into every corner of it, including whatever corners Colt occupied. Watching her admit, even in this small, defensive way, that she'd simply trusted him without checking, without asking the kind of question Raymond had trained me to ask automatically, told me something I hadn't fully considered before that moment. She might not have known, not the scope of it, anyway. She'd built her entire understanding of her son on faith rather than verification, the exact opposite of everything Raymond had spent 18 months teaching me. I trust my son, she said again, like repeating it might make it truer. I trust that whatever Priya's people find, there's an explanation for it that isn't what you're assuming. I'm not assuming anything, I said. I'm looking at what the numbers say. That's all I've ever done, with any of this. And it's the only thing I actually know how to do. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, not drinking it, just holding it like it gave her something to do with her hands that wasn't reaching for an argument she didn't currently have ammunition for. I noticed, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that her hands had started to look older than the rest of her carefully maintained appearance ever let on. Small lines across the knuckles that no amount of composure could quite manage. "He's my son," she said finally. The same 3 words rearranged, like changing their order might change what they were carrying. I trust him. Her voice caught slightly on the second sentence. Almost nothing, the kind of hesitation I might have missed entirely a year earlier. Before I'd learned to notice exactly this sort of small crack in people who otherwise worked very hard never to show one, I didn't say anything back to that. There wasn't a version of that sentence I could argue with, not really, because it wasn't a claim about facts. It was a claim about loyalty, offered up in place of the verification she hadn't done. I thought, walking back to my car afterward, about all the years I'd resented her for choosing Colt so visibly, so often, in ways large and small, at every dinner table and every school event and every quiet family argument I could remember losing before I'd even finished making my case. I'd always assumed that choosing him meant she understood him completely, that her favoritism came bundled with genuine knowledge of who he actually was. Sitting across from her that morning, I understood for the first time that she might have spent just as many years as I had, constructing a version of Colt that was easier to love than the real one turned out to be. I finished my coffee, told her I needed to get back to work, and left her sitting there with a cup she still hadn't touched, staring at a table that had nothing left on it to look at except her own uncertainty. Priya asked me to come by her office again the following week, and this time Whitfield joined by phone, his voice coming through a small speaker set in the middle of her desk, while she walked us both through what her team had found. We subpoenaed Ridgeline's banking records through proper legal channels. Once the estate's counsel filed the appropriate motion, she said. That took slightly longer than I would have liked, but it gave us something my earlier document review alone couldn't have. She pulled up a flowchart on her monitor, boxes connected by arrows, the kind of diagram I recognized from my own work reconciling supply chains. Except this one traced money instead of pallets. Ridgeline receives payment from Colby Custom Coach here, she said, tapping the first box. From there, A consistent percentage, not all of it, which is important. Roughly 29% of each payment gets transferred within a few business days to a second entity. CJD Holdings. CJD, I repeated, the initials arranging themselves in my head before she said anything further. Colt James Doyle, Whitfield's voice said through the speaker, confirming what I'd already started to suspect. That's the name associated with the account CJD Holdings was registered under, according to state filing records. The registered mailing address is a private mailbox rental facility approximately 15 minutes from Colt's residence. I sat back in my chair. Somewhere underneath the shock, a smaller, colder part of me was simply doing the math the way I did math at my own job, not with outrage yet. Just with the flat arithmetic of confirming a pattern that had already, on some level, stopped surprising me. I thought about the version of Colt I'd grown up with. The one who used to take the last seat at every family gathering as though it had been reserved for him by default. Who'd never once in 30-some years had to ask twice for anything he wanted. I'd always assumed his confidence came from somewhere uncomplicated good instincts, a natural ease with people, the kind of charm that made rooms lean toward him without him having to try. Watching a flowchart trace his initials to a mailbox 15 minutes from his house told a different story. Whatever ease he carried into a room. Some of it had apparently been paid for quietly, one invoice at a time, for years. How much? I asked. Has moved through CJD so far? We've traced $61,500 conclusively. Priya said. That figure will likely grow as the subpoena process continues, and we get access to a longer transaction history. I want to be precise about what I'm claiming and what I'm not claiming yet. 61.5 is confirmed, traceable, documented. The total exposure across the full 3-year Ridgeline relationship could be considerably higher, but I won't put a number to that until I can support it the same way I'm supporting this one. What happens next? I asked. 2 things, Whitfield said. First, this becomes part of the formal presentation at the next governance session, alongside whatever additional documentation Priya's team compiles between now and then. Second, and more immediately useful, we approach the vendor Ridgeline effectively replaced 3 years ago, someone with first-hand knowledge of how Colt negotiated that transition. I understand you may actually have a name for us already, given what you told Priya about Dwayne Pratt. I only know him socially, I said. Barely that. I wouldn't know anything about a vendor Ridgeline replaced. That's fine, Priya said. I have a name already, from public procurement records predating Ridgeline's onboarding. A woman named Marisol Vance ran an independent trim shop that supplied Colby Custom Coach for nearly a decade before Ridgeline took over the account almost overnight. I'd like to reach out to her directly, but given the sensitivity, I wanted both of you aware before I made that call. I told her to go ahead. Whitfield agreed. Before we ended the call, he added one more thing, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard from him before, even during the will reading itself. I'll say this plainly, he said. What we're describing now is materially more serious than anything in the first governance session. Your mother's conduct, whatever its faults, stayed within the boundaries of poor discretion. This traces actual company funds to a personal account belonging to your brother. That distinction matters, legally and otherwise, and I want you prepared for how differently the next session is likely to unfold because of it. I thanked him, hung up, and sat alone in Priya's small office for a moment, before either of us said anything else. Letting the number settle the way a diagnosis settles once you've heard it stated plainly enough that you can no longer pretend you misunderstood it the first time. For what it's worth, Priya said quietly, closing the flowchart on her screen. The amount was never really the point. For your uncle, he could have written a check for $61,000 without noticing it was gone. What he couldn't tolerate was not knowing. That's usually what drives people to do this kind of work in the first place. In my experience, not the money itself, The refusal to keep living inside a version of events they knew wasn't true. I drove home that evening with the radio off, turning her sentence over the whole way, thinking about how much of my own life I'd spent doing the exact opposite, living inside versions of my family that I'd quietly known weren't quite true, because the alternative had always seemed harder than simply getting along. Priya reached Marisol Vance within a few days, and to her credit, Marisol agreed to meet in person rather than simply talking through counsel, which was how I ended up sitting across from her at a diner off the highway between Elkhart and the county line. Priya beside me, a recorder placed openly on the table between us so there'd be no question later about what had or hadn't been said. Marisol was maybe 50, sturdy in the way of someone who'd spent decades doing physical work with her hands, wearing a fleece vest with an embroidered logo I didn't recognize from any company still in business. She ordered coffee, black, and didn't touch it for the first several minutes of the conversation. "I ran Redline Trimworks for 11 years, she said. Supplied Colby Custom Coach almost that entire time. Good relationship for most of it. Raymond and I never had a crossword between us in a decade of doing business together." "What changed?" Priya asked. "Colt happened," Marisol said, without hesitation, the words coming out flat and practiced, like she'd rehearsed saying them out loud more than once in the years since. "About 3.5 years ago, right around when he took over trim procurement fully from the previous sales manager, he came to me wanting a 12% price reduction across the board. Told me it was standard belt tightening. Company-wide, nothing personal. I did the math. 12% would have put me underwater on labor costs within 18 months. I told him I couldn't do it and stay in business. And I asked. And within 2 months, my orders started shrinking. Not canceled outright, just smaller, less frequent. Enough that I couldn't prove anything deliberate was happening, even though I felt it happening. 6 months after that, I got a call saying Colby Custom Coach was moving in a different direction with a new vendor. No specifics, just different direction." She finally picked up her coffee, took a sip, set it back down. "I laid off 4 people that year. Good people, some of them with me since I opened the shop. I've never fully recovered the volume I lost. I thought about Raymond's kitchen table, the notebook, the 18 months of Sunday afternoons he'd spent making sure I could recognize a pattern like this one when it eventually surfaced. He'd never mentioned Marisol by name, not once. But I understood, sitting there listening to her describe the exact shape of what had happened to her business, that he must have known some version of this story, even if he'd never had the specific proof to act on it while he was alive. Maybe that was part of what those Sunday conversations had actually been about, not just training me to catch numbers that didn't add up, but training me to feel the particular weight of what those numbers eventually cost. Someone real. I felt something tighten in my chest, listening to her. It was one thing to see numbers on a screen, dollar figures moving between entities, abstractions that lived comfortably inside a spreadsheet. It was another thing entirely to sit across from a woman who'd lost part of her livelihood because my brother had decided her honest pricing was less useful to him than a vendor willing to quietly kick a piece of it back. "Do you know Dwayne Pratt?" Priya asked. "I know of him," Marisol said. "Never met him personally. Everyone in the trim supply business around here knew Ridgeline came out of nowhere and started underbidding everyone by margins that didn't make sense for the quality they were supposedly delivering. A few of us talked about it at a trade association meeting once. Nobody could figure out how they were staying profitable at those prices. Now I suppose I understand." "Would you be willing to provide a formal statement," Priya asked, "about the pricing pressure and the timeline of your account's decline? Nothing about Ridgeline specifically, since you don't have direct knowledge there. Just your own experience." Marisol was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table. "What's in it for me?" she said finally. "Besides feeling like I finally got to say this out loud to somebody who'll write it down," Priya answered carefully. the way I imagined she answered every question that touched on compensation. The estate has an outstanding balance related to a disputed final invoice from your original contract. I understand, one that was never fully resolved when your account transitioned away. I can't promise anything specific today, but I can tell you the trust overseeing this review has expressed willingness to revisit unresolved vendor disputes as part of restoring proper governance. That's a conversation for Grant Whitfield's office, formally, separate from this statement. Marisol nodded slowly, like she was weighing something she'd already mostly decided before we'd even sat down. "I'll give you a statement," she said. "Not because of the money, though I won't pretend that doesn't matter. Because I want it on record somewhere that isn't just my own memory. I've told this story to my husband 100 times over 3 years. It's about time somebody with the authority to do something about it heard it too." Before we left the diner, she reached across the table and shook my hand, her grip firmer than I expected. "You look like your uncle," she said unprompted. "Same way of listening to somebody without rushing them along." He used to do that too, back when he still handled some of the vendor relationships himself, before he stepped back from that side of things. I always liked that about him. It wasn't much, just an offhand observation from a woman who'd known Raymond only through business dealings a decade earlier. But it stayed with me the whole drive home. A small, unexpected inheritance I hadn't known to look for. The rumors picked up speed after that dinner, and I suspect Colt knew, on some level, that he needed a story to compete with whatever was actually happening in Priya's office, even if he didn't know the full shape of what she'd already found. 2 employees I'd never met personally called me within the same week, both of them longtime hourly workers on the assembly floor, both of them repeating some version of the same thing they'd apparently heard from Colt directly. "Nora's trying to sell off the company. Nora brought in outside people to force Raymond's family out for good. Nora never even liked this place, and now she's punishing everyone who works here for something that isn't their fault." I told each of them, as calmly as I could, that no sale was being discussed, that the review existed to protect the company, not dismantle it, and that I understood why second-hand information without context could sound alarming. Neither of them sounded fully convinced. I couldn't blame them for that. I wasn't in a position to explain the parts that would have actually convinced them. The screenshots arrived a few days later, forwarded to me by a cousin who claimed she thought I deserved to see them, though I suspected some smaller part of her simply wanted to watch how I'd react. They came from an old family group chat, 2 years old, a thread I'd been quietly removed from at some point without ever being told, apparently still active among everyone else. My mother had written, in a message timestamped one afternoon, "I didn't remember at all Raymond's getting paranoid about expenses in his old age. Nora keeps feeding that paranoia because she loves feeling important for once." Colt's reply came 4 minutes later. "Keep clipboard Nora away from the real numbers. She'll just make everyone's life difficult over nothing." I read both messages twice. I sat with my phone in my lap for a long moment before reading them a third time, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less blunt, the way you sometimes hope a bruise will look smaller in better light. It didn't rearrange itself. It said exactly what it said, in exactly the order they'd typed it, 2 years before either of them had any reason to think I'd ever see it. I expected them to hurt more than they did. Instead, something in me went strangely quiet and clear, the way a room goes quiet right after a loud noise finally stops. 2 years earlier, those messages would have confirmed my worst private suspicion about exactly how little either of them thought of me. Now, reading them again in the middle of everything Priya had already found, they didn't feel like an insult anymore. They felt like a timestamp, proof that the dismissiveness hadn't started with the will reading. It had been running underneath the surface the entire time, patient and unbothered, waiting for a moment exactly like this one to finally show itself in writing. The cousin who'd forwarded them texted again a few minutes later asking if I was okay, adding that she'd almost decided not to send them at all. I told her the truth, that I was glad she had, because pretending those messages didn't exist wouldn't have made the sentiment behind them any less real, and I'd rather know exactly what I was dealing with than keep guessing at it the way I'd guessed at it my entire life. I didn't repost them anywhere. I didn't send them to the aunts and cousins who'd been calling me all week with their second-hand version of events, tempting as that would have been in the moment. I forwarded the screenshots to Whitfield's office instead, along with a short note explaining where they'd come from and why I thought they were relevant evidence, however small, of how long this particular pattern of dismissal had been operating, and a possible indication of what my mother had privately believed about Raymond's mental state well before anyone tried to argue his competency in a legal setting. Whitfield replied within the hour, thanking me for forwarding them, noting they'd be added to the file as potentially relevant to a related but separate line of inquiry his office was pursuing quietly, something he said he'd explain more fully once it had actually gone somewhere concrete. He didn't elaborate further than that, and I didn't push him to. I'd learned enough by then to recognize when someone was being careful on purpose, rather than evasive, and I trusted the difference. 2 employees calling to repeat a rumor was one thing, a cousin forwarding an old screenshot was another, but it was the accumulation of all of it together, arriving within the same single week, that made the whole family feel, for the first time, like a system rather than a collection of individuals, a system that had apparently agreed, long before I understood any of it, on exactly how much space I was allowed to take up. That night, sitting alone with my phone open to the screenshot one more time, I thought about Raymond's handwritten note again. Don't use this to punish them. Use it to make it impossible for anyone to keep hiding. I understood, reading those 2 messages for what felt like the 100th time, exactly what he'd meant by the distinction. It would have been easy to screenshot my own reply and send it back into that group chat to let everyone see exactly how it felt landing on the other end. It wouldn't have proven anything except that I could be cruel too. When given the opportunity, I closed the thread instead and went to bed. Warren Talbot called me directly the following Monday, which surprised me, since I'd never once had a personal conversation with him in my entire life beyond a handshake at Raymond's funeral. He introduced himself as though I might have forgotten who he was, his voice warm in the practiced way of a man who'd spent decades making people feel comfortable before asking them for something. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," he said. "I've known your uncle for the better part of 30 years. Business partner and outside counsel both, at different points. I'd like to think that history earns me a phone call every now and then, even in circumstances like these." I told him I didn't mind, though something in the framing put me faintly on guard before he'd even gotten to his actual point. Talbot had a voice built for exactly this kind of call, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who'd spent his career convincing people that the reasonable choice and his preferred choice happened, conveniently, to always be the same one. "I wanted to offer a perspective, if you'll allow it," he said. "I've watched a lot of family businesses go through exactly this kind of stress test over the years. The instinct to escalate everything through formal governance channels, board sessions, outside forensic teams. It's understandable, especially given how this began. But I've also seen it do real damage that outlasts whatever it was meant to fix. Clients get spooked. Employees start polishing their resumes. Sometimes the healthiest thing for everyone, including the company Raymond spent his whole life building, is to let a smaller circle handle the more sensitive pieces quietly, with appropriate legal safeguards, rather than airing every finding in front of a full, independent board." "Which pieces would you consider more sensitive?" I asked. He paused, just slightly, before answering. A pause I might not have noticed a month earlier, but noticed clearly now. "The vendor relationship matters, particularly," he said. "Colt's situation, specifically. I think there's a version of resolving that concern that protects the company's reputation with clients and suppliers without requiring a full public accounting in front of 3 independent board members who don't have the same long-term stake in this family's future that you and I do. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over anything that arrived wrapped in language this careful. Grant Whitfield hasn't suggested anything like that, I said. Neither has Priya. Grant and Priya are doing exactly what their engagements require them to do, Talbot said smoothly. I'm simply offering you a broader view. As someone who's watched this company and this family for longer than either of them has known you. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Nora. I'm suggesting proportion. I told him I appreciated the call, that I'd think about what he'd said, and ended the conversation a few minutes later without committing to anything either way. I sat at my kitchen table afterward, replaying it, trying to identify exactly what had unsettled me about a conversation that, on its surface, hadn't contained a single objectionable sentence. It was the specificity that bothered me most, turning it over again later that evening. Talbot hadn't spoken in vague terms about my mother's situation, which had already been presented publicly at the first governance session. He'd gone straight to Colt's situation, specifically, using language that suggested he already understood exactly how serious it was, before Priya's full findings on Ridgeline and CJD Holdings had even been formally presented anywhere Talbot should reasonably have had access to. Yet, I didn't have proof of anything. I didn't even have a clear accusation forming in my mind. Not yet, just a small, persistent unease. The same feeling I got at work when a number looked technically correct but somehow still wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. I made a note of the call in my own private file that evening, dated and detailed, the same habit Raymond had apparently taught me without either of us calling it that at the time. Writing down not just what Talbot had said, but the exact order he'd said it in, since I'd learned by now that order mattered almost as much as content once a pattern started to matter. I didn't mention it to Priya right away. I wanted to see if the feeling held up under a second look before I brought anyone else into it. I thought back, later that week, to the small handful of times I'd actually encountered Talbot in person over the years, mostly at company holiday parties. Always near Raymond, always with a drink in one hand and an easy laugh ready for whoever needed one. I'd never once thought to ask what, exactly, his business relationship with Colby Custom Coach actually consisted of, beyond the vague label everyone in the family used for him. Family lawyer? Business partner? I realized, turning the phrase over, that I didn't actually know what either half of it meant in practical terms, or how deep the partner half of it really went. It was the kind of gap in my own knowledge that Raymond's notebook would have flagged immediately. Had he ever thought to ask me about it? He never had. I wondered, not for the first time, whether that omission had been an oversight, or whether Talbot had simply never made it onto Raymond's list of people worth quietly investigating, right up until it was too late for him to add it. The second governance meeting filled the training room more completely than the first had. Colt arrived with his own attorney this time, a younger man named Bryce, who spent the opening minutes reviewing a printed agenda like he intended to object to its formatting before anyone had said a single substantive word. Priya opened with the flowchart she'd shown me and Whitfield weeks earlier, projected now onto the pull-down screen for the full board to see. She walked through Ridgeline's invoicing pattern methodically. The duplicated language, the mismatched delivery dates against production records, the $214,750 in total payments across 3 years. Bryce interrupted before she'd finished the first slide. My client's vendor relationships fall under standard sales division discretion. Pricing negotiations, volume commitments, none of that requires board-level scrutiny under normal governance. Normal discretion doesn't typically involve a registered LLC receiving 29% of every payment within days of receipt, Priya said, unbothered, and clicked to the next slide before Bryce could respond. The flowchart appeared again. CJD Holdings highlighted, the private mailbox address printed clearly beneath it. This entity is registered under the name Colt James Doyle. We've traced $61,500 conclusively into accounts associated with that registration." The room went very still. Colt's face, which had held a careful, practiced calm through the entire first slide, changed in a way he didn't seem able to control. My mother, seated 2 chairs down from him this time rather than beside him, looked at the screen with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn a version of it myself weeks earlier, the particular blankness of someone doing rapid, involuntary math on a number they hadn't seen coming. "That doesn't prove I took anything," he said before his attorney could stop him. "Nobody said you did," I replied, from my seat beside Whitfield. "Not yet." He turned toward me with an expression I remembered from childhood, the specific look he used to give me whenever I'd ruined a joke by refusing to laugh at his expense. "You think you understand this business because Raymond let you look at a few spreadsheets on a Sunday afternoon. I think I understand a flowchart with your initials on it," I said. "That's not the same thing as spreadsheets. Colt, that's a paper trail," Priya continued before either of us could escalate further, introducing Marisol Vance's statement next, reading key portions aloud for the record. The 12% pricing demand, the gradually shrinking orders, the abrupt transition to Ridgeline within months of her refusal, and the 4 laid-off employees Marisol had named specifically in her signed statement. Bryce objected to its relevance repeatedly, arguing that a competitor's business decline proved nothing about wrongdoing. Dr. Patel, presiding again alongside the other 2 board members, allowed it to stand as part of the documented pattern regardless, noting for the record that pattern evidence was precisely what this preliminary session existed to establish. "This is a coordinated attack," Colt said, standing partway out of his chair. "Raymond's forensic accountant, some vendor with an axe to grind, my own sister sitting there like she's earned a seat in this room. None of you actually run this company. None of you have ever run a company in your lives. Your uncle ran this company," Whitfield said evenly, "for 40 years, considerably longer than you've run any part of it. And he built the structure you're currently sitting inside specifically because he anticipated a moment exactly like this one." Bryce placed a hand briefly on Colt's arm, a quiet signal to stop talking, and Colt, to his credit, actually stopped, dropping back into his chair with his jaw tight. The board recessed for 20 minutes before returning with their decision. "Dr. Patel read it aloud, her voice even and unhurried. "Pending the outcome of the full review, Colt Doyle's purchasing authority and vendor approval privileges are suspended effective immediately. His company purchasing card is deactivated as of this meeting. He remains employed in an advisory capacity only, pending further findings, and is barred from initiating new vendor contracts or approving existing account terms above any threshold for the duration of the review period." Colt didn't argue this time. He sat very still, staring at a point somewhere on the table in front of him. And for a moment I saw something in his face that looked less like anger and more like a man finally understanding the size of the hole he'd spent 3 years quietly digging underneath himself. Bryce leaned over and said something to him in a low voice, gathering papers, already moving toward the practical business of what came next, procedurally. My mother didn't look at Colt at all as the room began to empty. She stared instead at the now blank screen where the flowchart had been. And I understood, watching her, that whatever certainty she'd walked in with that morning, she was leaving with considerably less of it. Walt reached over and put a hand briefly on her shoulder, an old, automatic gesture of comfort. And for once she didn't shrug it off the way she usually did in public. I stayed behind a few minutes after most of the room had cleared, talking quietly with Whitfield about scheduling the next phase of the review, and I noticed, glancing back once, that my father had stayed seated beside my mother far longer than the moment strictly required, neither of them speaking, both of them simply absorbing in their own separate ways. Exactly how much had just changed. I drove to the plant a few days after that meeting, not for any official reason, just needing to stand somewhere that still felt like it belonged to Raymond rather than to a conference room full of attorneys. The assembly floor was quiet in the late afternoon lull between shift changes, and I found Inez Calder in the corner of the trim shop, checking a rack of finished cabinet doors against a work order. Exactly the kind of task I'd have done myself if I'd ever worked there. Inez had been at Colby Custom Coach for over 20 years, longer than almost anyone else on the floor, and Raymond had promoted her to lead the assembly team back when most of the plant still assumed a woman couldn't run that section as well as a man could. She looked up when she saw me and set down her clipboard. "Wondered when you'd come by," she said. "Word travels fast in a building this size. Everybody knows there's been meetings." I didn't come to talk about the meetings," I said, though we both understood that wasn't entirely true. She gestured toward 2 folding stools near her workbench, and I sat, grateful for somewhere quiet to just exist for a few minutes without being anyone's trustee or anyone's daughter or anyone's punchline. "Your uncle used to sit right there," she said, nodding at the second stool. "Most Friday afternoons, right before he headed home for the weekend. Liked to walk the floor first, see what everybody had actually built that week instead of just reading a production report." "I didn't know that," I said, and I meant it more deeply than the simple words probably conveyed. I'd spent my whole life assuming Raymond's attention toward me was something that happened only when I was directly in front of him. Those Sunday afternoons at his kitchen table, the 2 of us and a stack of paperwork. It had never occurred to me that he might have carried some version of me around with him during the rest of his week too, out here on this floor, among people I'd never met. "Lot you probably don't know," she said, not unkindly. "He didn't talk about family business on this floor. Kept that wall pretty firm, actually, now that I think about it. But he talked about you, not often, and never at length. But enough that I noticed it, because most fathers and uncles around here don't talk about their family that particular way." "What way is that, like he was watching you build something?" she said. "And he was proud of the specific way you were building it, not just proud in general the way people usually are about family. He told me once you'd caught an error in a shipping report at your own job that saved somebody real money. And he talked about it the way most men around here talk about their kids' football game. I remember thinking, that man really does see her." I felt something loosen in my chest, hearing that, a tightness I hadn't fully noticed carrying until it started to ease. 20 years of feeling invisible inside my own family, and here was a woman who barely knew me, telling me plainly that at least one person had been paying close attention the entire time, in a way none of us at that dinner table ever seemed to manage. "He'd be glad you're doing this," Inez said. "Not the part where everybody's angry at you. The part where you're not letting anybody talk you out of looking at what's actually true. That was always the thing he respected most in a person. Not being right, just being willing to keep looking." We sat there a while longer, not saying much else, watching the last of the afternoon light move slowly across the rows of finished cabinet doors, the smell of fresh-cut laminate and machine oil settling over both of us like something familiar neither of us needed to name out loud. Just before I left, she mentioned, almost offhand, the way people mention things that don't seem important until later. That Warren Talbot had come by the plant unannounced a few weeks before Raymond passed, closed the office door, and stayed almost 2 hours longer, she said, than she'd ever seen him stay for anything before, and not long after that. Raymond had the old phone line recorder in the back office serviced and upgraded, something he'd never bothered doing in all the years it had been sitting there gathering dust. I thanked her, and drove home turning that detail over the entire way, not yet sure what it meant, only sure that it meant something. Inez walked me out to my car before I left, unhurried, the way people move when they've spent a whole career not needing to rush toward anything. At the door, she squeezed my arm once, briefly, the kind of gesture that didn't need any words attached to it. "Whatever's coming next," she said. "You've got more people on this floor in your corner than you probably realize. We don't say much. Doesn't mean we're not watching who's actually telling the truth around here." I sat in my car for a minute after she'd gone back inside, before I even started the engine, letting that settle alongside everything else I'd learned that afternoon. It was the first time in weeks that something about this whole ordeal had felt less like a burden and more like a room slowly, quietly filling up with people who'd been on my side longer than I'd known to look for them. Colt was handled. Not finished, not yet, but handled in every way the review actually required. His authority suspended, his money traced, his own vendor turning against him the moment it benefited her more than her silence had. My mother's part of this story had shrunk down to something almost ordinary by comparison. A woman who'd trusted the wrong person a little too completely and would spend the next several months proving whether that trust had been the full extent of her failure or only the beginning of it. None of that explained Talbot. A man who'd known Raymond for 30 years, who called me unprompted to suggest keeping the most serious findings away from the very board Raymond had built to examine them. Who'd sat behind a closed office door with my uncle for 2 unexplained hours not long before he died. That man had access, history, and exactly the kind of quiet influence that never needed to raise its voice. If anyone had the standing to stop all of this before it reached a conference room, it was him. Instead, he'd spent his first real conversation with me trying to make sure it never reached one at all. Whitfield called me on a Wednesday morning, his voice carrying a formality I hadn't heard from him since the day of the will reading itself. "I need you to come by my office," he said. "Something's arrived that I want you to see in person, rather than discuss over the phone." I drove downtown that afternoon back to the same conference room where I'd first learned I was allowed to stay in a room I'd almost been kept out of. Whitfield had a single document laid flat on the table when I arrived. Several pages, a formal letterhead I recognized from Talbot's firm. "This arrived by courier yesterday," Whitfield said. "Sent on Warren Talbot's letterhead, addressed to my office as counsel for the estate. It purports to be a First Amendment to the voting trust your uncle established." The room looked exactly as it had the morning of the will reading. Same long table, same window overlooking the same unremarkable parking lot. And for a moment sitting back down in that particular chair felt like stepping backward into a version of that first morning I thought I'd already finished with. I sat down across from him and read the document slowly. It claimed, in careful legal language, that Raymond had expressed a clear and consistent intention, in conversations with Talbot over the final year of his life, to return full voting authority to Denise Doyle after an initial 6-month period. Once the forensic review had reached what the document called a natural resolution point, it cited no specific meeting date. It referenced no supporting correspondence. It simply asserted the intention as established fact, supported by Talbot's own signed affidavit as a witness to Raymond's wishes. "Is this legitimate?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer before I finished the question. I'd learned, over these past months, to distrust exactly this kind of feeling, the sense that something was probably fine, offered by someone whose interest in it being fine ran deeper than mine did. "I don't believe so," Whitfield said, "though I want to be precise about why, rather than simply reacting to the timing, which is admittedly suspicious on its own. Your uncle's original trust document specifies a very particular amendment procedure. Any modification requires either a formal codicil executed with the same witnessing requirements as the original will, or a court-supervised modification proceeding. This document does neither. It simply asserts itself as an amendment, based entirely on one man's account of private conversations nobody else was present for. Then why send it at all? If it's this weak, I asked, genuinely confused, since Talbot had spent decades practicing law well enough to know precisely how weak a document like this would look under real scrutiny. Whitfield considered the question carefully before answering. Some documents aren't built to win outright. They're built to create just enough uncertainty that a judge might feel compelled to pause the review pending further examination, or that your mother's counsel might use it as leverage in settlement discussions, regardless of whether it would ultimately hold up under real scrutiny. Delay itself has value, to certain people, at certain moments. I suspect that's the actual purpose here, more than any genuine expectation that this document controls the outcome on its own merits. I looked at the signature again, Talbot's name in a careful, practiced hand, and thought about the phone call weeks earlier. The specificity with which he'd already understood the seriousness of Colt's situation, before it had been formally presented anywhere he should have had access to. This wasn't a man improvising out of loyalty to an old friend's memory. This felt, reading the document a second time, like the next deliberate step in something that had started well before I'd noticed it beginning. "What do we do?" I asked, aware, as I said it, that I'd started using the word we without quite meaning to, as though Whitfield and I had become partners in something rather than simply lawyer and client. He didn't correct me. I noticed that too. First, I want to verify the formatting inconsistencies I noticed on my initial read. Whitfield said, "The date format used throughout doesn't match Raymond's usual conventions in any other document in his file, and the notary stamp appears unusual in ways I want confirmed by the notary's own office before I say anything further. Give me a day or two before we discuss this with anyone else, including your mother. I'd rather bring you something solid than something merely suspicious, particularly given whose signature is sitting at the bottom of that last page." I left his office that afternoon, carrying a version of dread I hadn't felt since the morning of the will reading itself, not fear of losing anything material, but the specific unease of watching a story you thought you finally understood reveal one more room underneath it that you hadn't known was there. Driving home, I found myself replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Talbot, searching for some earlier sign I might have missed. There wasn't much to search through: a handshake at the funeral, a voice on the phone offering advice dressed up as concern. It struck me, somewhere around the halfway point of the drive, that this was exactly the kind of man who could move through a family for decades, leaving almost no impression at all. Precisely because leaving no impression was the whole point of how he operated. Raymond had built systems to catch people who left too much of a trail. He may never have considered that the more dangerous risk was someone who'd learned, over a very long career, exactly how to leave none. Whitfield called again 2 days later, in the early evening, and this time his voice carried something closer to certainty than the careful caution he'd used at our last meeting. "I confirmed 2 things," he said. "First, the date format throughout the amendment uses a month-day-year sequence with dashes. Raymond used slashes exclusively. In every document I've ever seen him produce over 15 years of working with him, without a single exception across hundreds of pages. Small detail, but a consistent one. And consistency is exactly the kind of thing forgers overlook because it feels too trivial to bother replicating." I let that sit for a second, picturing Raymond at his desk decades earlier, filling out form after form the same exact way out of pure habit, never once imagining that habit would someday become the very thing that unraveled a forgery. "And the second thing, the notary stamp," he said. I called the notary's office directly. Their records show that specific commission had already expired 4 months before the date printed on this document. Either the notary backdated their own seal, which would be a serious professional violation on its own, or the document was stamped after the fact with an expired seal, and the date was altered to make it appear otherwise. I've requested the notary's full log for that period. I expect it will show no entry matching this transaction at all. I sat with that for a moment, the pieces settling into a shape I didn't want to look at directly yet. It struck me, oddly, that I felt none of the shock I might have expected. Somewhere over these past weeks I'd apparently learned to expect exactly this kind of discovery, the way you eventually stop being surprised by rot once you've found it in enough corners of the same house. So it's fabricated? I believe so. Yes, I want to be careful using that word publicly until I have the notary's log in hand. But privately, between us, I no longer think this is a case of aggressive interpretation or wishful memory on Talbot's part. I think this is a document that was constructed to look legitimate and very nearly succeeded. I've practiced estate law for over 20 years. Nora. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen a document this carefully assembled turn out to be genuine misunderstanding rather than deliberate construction. What happens now? I've requested a meeting with Talbot directly. Whitfield said, not through correspondence. In person, at my office, with his own counsel present if he chooses to bring one. I want to see how he responds to specific questions about the notary's commission status before he has time to prepare a polished answer. I'd like you there as well, if you're willing, not to speak necessarily, just present, as trustee. Since this document directly concerns your authority, I told him I'd be there. Some part of me had spent weeks bracing for a moment exactly like this one, without knowing what shape it would finally take. And now that it had a shape, I found myself less afraid of it than I expected to be. Before we ended the call, I asked him something that had been sitting with me since our first conversation about the amendment. Do you think Raymond suspected him at all? Before he died, Whitfield was quiet long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. I don't know, he said finally. I've gone back through every piece of correspondence Raymond ever sent my office, looking for any indication he doubted Talbot specifically. I haven't found one. But I've also noticed something else, going back through those same files. Raymond stopped copying Talbot on certain categories of communication roughly 8 months before he died, the same general window when he engaged Priya's firm. He never explained why. In writing, he simply stopped. That detail stayed with me longer than almost anything else Whitfield had told me. Longer even than the notary's expired seal. Longer than the mismatched date format. Raymond hadn't confronted Talbot, hadn't accused him of anything, hadn't left behind a single document naming him directly the way he'd named Denise and Colt. He'd simply, quietly, stopped including him in the parts of his life that mattered most. The same understated instinct he'd used with everyone else in this story. Trusting the paper trail to eventually speak for itself, rather than trusting his own suspicion enough to say it out loud before he had proof. I thought about the old phone recorder in the back office, serviced and upgraded not long after that same 8-month window Whitfield had just described, and felt something settle into place that I wasn't ready yet to say out loud either. I didn't mention Inez's story to Whitfield during that call. Part of me wanted more certainty before I handed him another thread to pull, given how much weight the last one had already carried. But driving home that evening, I found myself doing the same quiet arithmetic Raymond had apparently spent his final year doing, without ever once explaining his reasoning to anyone lining up dates. Watching a pattern take a shape I hadn't consciously assembled until all the pieces were sitting in front of me at once. 8 months. A closed office door for 2 hours. A recorder nobody had touched in years. Suddenly serviced and upgraded. None of it, on its own, proved anything at all. Together. It was starting to feel like exactly the kind of evidence my uncle had trained me to notice. I couldn't stop thinking about the recorder. Inez had mentioned it almost in passing. One small detail tucked inside a longer, warmer conversation. And I understood 3 days later that some part of me had been circling back to it ever since without fully admitting it to myself. Raymond had shown me that room himself, 18 months earlier, explaining the line recorder in the same offhand tone he'd used for everything else that Sunday afternoon. Nobody argues about who promised what over the phone anymore. He'd tapped the cabinet almost fondly when he said it. I called the plant's facilities manager, a quiet man named Sal who'd worked there almost as long as my father had, and asked if the recording archive still existed in any usable form. He told me most of it had been digitized a few years back for storage efficiency, but a physical archive of older tapes still sat in a locked cabinet in the same back room Raymond had shown me, untouched since before the digitization project, because nobody had ever gotten around to deciding whether they were worth keeping or discarding. I hadn't told anyone I was going, not even Whitfield, and driving out there alone felt like the closest I'd come in months to doing something purely for myself, separate from the trust, separate from the review. Just a niece trying to find one more piece of a man she missed more than she'd let herself admit out loud to anyone yet. I drove out that same afternoon. Sal met me at the door, unlocked the cabinet without asking too many questions, and left me alone with a shelf of labeled cassette boxes going back further than I'd expected, organized by year in Raymond's own handwriting on strips of masking tape gone yellow with age. I searched for the window Whitfield had described the 8 months before Raymond's death, the period when he'd apparently stopped copying Talbot on certain communications. Most of that stretch had already been digitized, according to the labels, boxes marked with a small check mark indicating they'd been transferred and could technically be discarded. I worked through the shelf methodically, the way I'd sort through any inventory discrepancy at my own job, checking each label against the date range I was looking for before moving on to the next. One box, near the back of the shelf, had no check mark at all. The label read simply, "Office line, personal, do not digitize." I sat with that box in my lap for a long moment before opening it. There was something almost too intimate about the phrase personal, written in my uncle's own hand, on a box he'd apparently decided deserved a different kind of privacy than everything around it, the same careful instinct he'd shown with everything else he'd left behind for me to eventually find. Inside were 4 cassettes, unlabeled beyond a date range scrawled across each spine. I didn't have anything at the plant that could play them. I asked Sal if the old office phone system itself was still functional, and he pointed me toward a dusty console in the same back room, explaining that the plant had switched most of its phone infrastructure over years ago, but had never formally decommissioned the analog recording unit, since nobody had seen a reason to spend money removing something that wasn't hurting anything by sitting there unused. It took nearly 40 minutes and a phone call to Sal's cousin, who'd apparently done audio equipment repair as a hobby for years, before we had the old unit powering on again, its small indicator light blinking amber after what must have been years of silence. Sal watched the whole process with the mild, patient curiosity of a man who'd spent decades keeping old machinery alive well past the point anyone expected it to still function. And he told me, almost as an aside, that Raymond used to check on that recorder personally every few months, long after everyone else in the building had forgotten it existed at all. My hand actually hovered over the console once, the old play button worn smooth from decades of use, before I stopped myself and set the cassette back down. I called Priya before pressing play on anything. This felt, suddenly, like exactly the kind of discovery she'd want documented from the very first moment, rather than something I stumbled through alone in an empty back room. She told me to wait for her, that she'd drive out immediately, and that under no circumstances should I play or handle the tapes further until she arrived to properly document the chain of custody, sealing each cassette in its own labeled bag before anyone so much as touched the play button. I sat in that small, dusty room for the better part of an hour, waiting, staring at 4 unlabeled cassettes that might contain nothing at all, or might contain exactly the piece of this story Raymond had never quite managed to say to me directly while he was alive. The room hadn't changed much since the Sunday afternoon he'd first shown it to me. Same taped wires along the baseboard, same faint smell of old dust and warm electronics, same single high window letting in a narrow strip of afternoon light across the floor. I thought about him standing exactly where I was standing now, tapping that metal cabinet with something close to affection, telling me it kept people honest without him having to stand over their shoulder. I wondered if he'd known, even then, how literally that sentence might someday turn out to be true. Priya arrived within the hour, moving through the process with a calm efficiency that steadied me more than I expected it to. She photographed each cassette in place before touching them, sealed them individually in labeled evidence bags, and only then, back at her own office 2 days later, with a chain of custody log already started and Whitfield looped in by phone, did we finally sit down to listen. The first 2 tapes contained nothing unusual routine vendor calls, a scheduling dispute with a freight company. Raymond's own voice sounding younger and more relaxed than I remembered him ever sounding in the last year of his life. The 3rd tape ran almost to its end before anything of note surfaced, mostly silence punctuated by the occasional test tone, the kind of recording that happens when a line stays open without anyone actually speaking into it. By the time we reached that 4th tape, I'd almost convinced myself we'd find nothing at all, that Raymond's careful labeling had simply been an old man's private habit, rather than evidence of anything specific. Priya fed the cassette into the machine without comment, and the small amber light on the console blinked steady while the reels began to turn. It was the 4th tape that mattered. The recording began mid-conversation, the connection already established. Raymond's voice and another man's voice already deep into a discussion neither of them seemed to realize was being preserved anywhere permanent. "And I'm telling you, Warren, this can wait until after the fiscal year closes," Raymond's voice said, tired in a way I hadn't heard from him often, even toward the end. "I don't need this getting in front of the board before I've had a chance to understand it myself. Ray, listen to me." Talbot's voice, unmistakable, warmer and more familiar than I'd ever heard it directed at me. "Whatever Colt's doing with this vendor, it's not worth blowing up the whole sales division over. Let me talk to Denise. She can rein him in quietly. No accountants, no board meetings, no paper trail that outlives the problem itself. You bring in outside people. You're not protecting this company. You're handing it a story it'll never fully recover from. And if Denise already knows more than she's telling me, a pause on the tape, just long enough to feel deliberate, then that's exactly why you let me handle it instead of some accountant who doesn't understand what this family actually needs to survive intact." Priya paused the recording there, glancing at both of us before continuing. Whitfield's voice, thin through the phone speaker, asked her to play the final section again. Slower. The tape continued a few seconds later, Raymond's voice noticeably harder than before. "You're not answering my question. Warren, does Denise know Talbot's answer came quieter, almost too quiet for the recording to catch cleanly, and Priya had to raise the volume before any of us could make out the words clearly enough to be certain. Everybody knows something? Ray, the question is whether you actually want to find out how much, or whether you'd rather keep pretending this family runs itself as clean as you built it to look on paper." The recording ended shortly after that, cut off mid-exchange. Whatever came next lost to whatever had caused the tape itself to stop rolling. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Even Priya, who'd sat across from families through countless recordings and revelations over the course of her career, let the silence stretch longer than her usual professional pace allowed, as though some part of her understood this particular tape needed a moment of its own before anyone reduced it to strategy. Priya finally spoke first, her voice careful, precise, already thinking several steps ahead the way she always did. "That establishes prior knowledge," she said, tapping the pause button one final time so the recording wouldn't accidentally continue while she spoke. Talbot knew, at minimum, that something serious was happening with Colt's vendor relationships well before Priya's firm was formally engaged, and he actively advised your uncle against pursuing it through proper channels. Combined with the fabricated amendment, this is no longer a question of one man giving bad advice out of misplaced loyalty. Whitfield's voice came through the speaker, quieter than I'd heard it in any of our previous conversations. "This is a legally admissible recording, made under a policy the company had publicly posted for years, involving a business line both parties understood to be recorded. I want to convene a meeting with Talbot immediately, formally, this time, with his own counsel present, and this recording ready to be played the moment it becomes relevant. I sat with the sound of my uncle's tired voice still echoing in my head, thinking about how many Sunday afternoons he must have spent, after that call, quietly building a structure specifically designed to survive without needing to trust a man he could no longer fully trust. It was strange, hearing him again after months of only having his handwriting to go on. His voice sounded exactly the way I remembered it, unhurried even under pressure. And it struck me that this was probably the last unguarded version of him I'd ever get to hear a man still working out, in real time. Exactly how much damage was sitting underneath his own company, with no idea yet how completely he'd eventually need to rebuild his trust in every single person around that table, including the one he'd once considered closest to him outside the family itself. Talbot arrived at Whitfield's office 3 days later, wearing the same easy confidence he'd carried into every conversation I'd had with him. A younger attorney beside him, carrying a leather portfolio he never opened during the entire meeting. "Grant tells me there's some confusion about a trust amendment," Talbot said, settling into his chair like a man attending a routine business lunch rather than a confrontation. "I'm happy to clarify whatever's needed. Raymond and I discussed his long-term intentions many times over the years. I stand by the accuracy of what I submitted." I sat near the end of the table, close enough to watch Talbot's face without staring directly at it, the way I'd learned to observe things at my own job peripherally, patiently, waiting for the moment a pattern revealed itself rather than forcing it. He hadn't so much as glanced at me since walking in, which struck me as its own small piece of information. Every previous conversation we'd had, however brief, he'd made a point of addressing me warmly, almost paternally. Today, he hadn't looked at me once. Whitfield didn't respond right away. He simply set a folder on the table, unopened, and let the silence stretch a beat longer than felt comfortable before he spoke. "Mr. Talbot, I want to ask you directly, and I'd ask you to consider your answer carefully before you give it. When did you first become aware of irregularities involving Ridgeline trim supply and Colt Doyle's vendor management?" "I couldn't say precisely," Talbot said smoothly. "There may have been general conversation about vendor performance over the years, the way there always is in a business this size. Nothing specific comes to mind." "Nothing specific," Whitfield repeated, his voice entirely level. "Not a conversation advising Raymond to handle it privately through Denise, rather than involving outside accountants or the board." Something flickered across Talbot's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. The same practiced recovery I imagined he'd perfected across 4 decades of exactly these kinds of rooms. "I offer general guidance to clients constantly. Grant, you know that as well as I do. I couldn't possibly recall the specifics of every conversation from years ago." His attorney finally spoke up, adjusting the portfolio he still hadn't opened. "If this line of questioning is heading toward some kind of formal allegation, I'd like to understand the basis for it before my client continues answering." "The basis," Whitfield said, "is a recorded telephone conversation made on a business line your client and my client both understood to be recorded under a policy posted at Colby Custom Coach for well over a decade. I'll play it now, and then we can discuss whatever objections you'd like to raise afterward." "Let me help refresh your memory, then," Whitfield said. He nodded once toward Priya, who'd been sitting quietly at the end of the table with a small recorder of her own, and pressed a single button. My uncle's voice filled the room again, tired and unmistakable, followed a moment later by Talbot's own voice, warmer than I'd ever heard it directed at anyone in this family, urging Raymond to let Denise handle Colt quietly. No accountants, no board meetings, no paper trail that outlives the problem itself. Talbot's face went very still. The recording continued for nearly a minute before Whitfield stopped it, the final exchange hanging in the air of the conference room exactly as it had hung in that dusty back office where I'd first found it. Everybody knows something. Ray, the question is whether you actually want to find out how much. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Talbot's young attorney glanced sideways at his client, visibly recalculating something behind his own carefully composed expression. That recording could be taken out of context, Talbot said finally, though the easy confidence had drained noticeably from his voice. The recording is dated, complete, and consistent with a publicly posted company policy governing that specific line. Whitfield said, I don't believe context is the issue here, Warren. I believe the issue is that you knew about Colt's conduct well before this review began, actively advised against proper channels, and then submitted a fabricated trust amendment attempting to reverse the outcome of a process you'd already tried once to prevent. Talbot didn't answer immediately. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, like a man calculating not what to say next, but how much longer silence might still serve him better than any answer he could construct. His young attorney leaned over and whispered something too quiet for the rest of us to catch, and Talbot gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The gesture of a man declining advice he'd already decided wasn't going to help him anymore. I found myself thinking, watching him sit there in that particular silence, about all the family holiday parties where he'd occupied exactly this kind of chair, drink in hand, easy laugh ready, never once looking like a man capable of sitting this still, this cornered, this aware that the room around him had finally stopped believing whatever version of events he offered it next. I'd like a moment with my client, the young attorney said finally, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone realizing, in real time, that the case he'd walked in prepared to defend no longer resembled the one currently sitting in front of him. Whitfield agreed to a short recess, and Priya switched off her recorder, though she left it sitting visibly on the table. A small, deliberate reminder that this conversation was continuing whether or not the room chose to acknowledge it out loud. When the meeting resumed 20 minutes later, something had changed in the room before anyone said a single word. Talbot sat with both hands flat on the table, no longer leaning back with the easy confidence he'd carried in with him. His attorney spoke first. My client is prepared to make a full statement, he said, in exchange for the estate agreeing not to pursue criminal referral regarding the recording's discovery circumstances, and with the understanding that his statement addresses only his own conduct, not speculation about the conduct of others. Whitfield considered that for a moment. I can't bind the estate to withholding a criminal referral if the facts warrant one. What I can agree to is that nothing about how the recording was discovered will be characterized as improper, since it was found on company property, on a company-owned recording system, under a policy your client was aware of. Beyond that, I make no promises about what happens after I hear what he has to say. Talbot's attorney glanced at his client, who nodded slightly, and then Talbot began speaking. His voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped entirely of the warm, persuasive register he'd used on every previous call. I've known about Colt's arrangement with Ridgeline for just over 3 years, he said. Not the exact mechanics at first. I suspected something was off with the pricing structure fairly early, given how aggressively Ridgeline was undercutting every other vendor Colby Custom Coach had used. I raised it with Colt directly, privately, about 2 years ago. And what did he tell you? Whitfield asked, his tone carrying no particular judgment yet, simply the patient insistence of a man determined to get the full account laid out in order. He told me it was complicated, and that I should let him handle his own division. I let it go further than I should have. Talbot paused, his hands tightening slightly against the table's edge. Colby Custom Coach has been my single largest ongoing client relationship for over 15 years. I hold an indirect interest in a small investment fund that provides equipment financing to several of the company's suppliers, including, as it happens, an entity connected to Ridgeline's operations. I didn't structure that connection maliciously. It predates Colt's arrangement by several years. But once I understood what was happening, disclosing it properly would have meant disclosing my own conflict of interest at the same time, and I made the wrong choice about which problem felt more survivable. The room was silent enough that I could hear the recorder's small indicator light humming faintly on the table. I thought, listening to him, about every dinner party and company gathering where he'd stood beside Raymond with a drink in his hand, laughing at exactly the right moments. And I understood now that some of that ease had never been friendship at all. It had been maintenance, carefully applied, on a relationship he needed intact for reasons that had nothing to do with 30 years of history. So when Raymond started asking questions, Whitfield said, you advised him against pursuing them formally, not out of loyalty to this family, but to protect your own financial exposure. That's not entirely fair, Talbot said, though his voice carried none of its usual conviction. I did care about this family. I'd known Raymond 30 years. But yes, I also had something to lose if this came out the way it's coming out now, and I let that shape my advice more than I should have, more than I let myself admit at the time, even to myself. And the trust amendment. Talbot was quiet for a long moment. That was mine alone, he said finally. Raymond never said those words to me. I drafted it hoping a delay, even an unsuccessful one, might buy enough time to resolve the Ridgeline situation quietly before the full scope became public. It was a mistake. I understand that now. Sitting here, I understood it the moment you played that recording. Whitfield closed the folder in front of him. The first physical gesture he'd made in several minutes, the kind of small, deliberate motion that signals a decision has already been reached, and no further discussion will change it. Warrant, effective today. You're removed from any advisory role connected to this estate or to Colby Custom Coach. I'll be referring the fabricated document to the State Bar's Ethics Committee, and the estate will independently evaluate whether a criminal referral regarding that specific document is warranted. Your cooperation today will be noted in that process. It doesn't erase what led to it. Talbot nodded once, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked directly at me, across the length of that long table, and said nothing at all, no apology, no explanation, just a long, tired look that told me, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much he'd understood about what he'd done, and exactly how long he'd known it before any of us had caught up to him. I didn't feel triumphant, sitting there watching him gather his things a few minutes later, his young attorney already speaking in low, urgent tones about next steps. I felt, mostly, a kind of quiet exhaustion. The particular tiredness that comes after finally setting down something you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten how heavy it actually was. Whitfield caught my eye briefly as Talbot left the room, and neither of us said anything. There wasn't anything left to say that the recording hadn't already said more plainly than either of us could have managed. News of Talbot's removal moved through the company faster than any of the earlier findings had, and I understood why almost immediately. Denise's mistakes had been the kind of thing employees could rationalize, a mother protecting a son, familiar and almost forgivable in its shape. Colt's had been shocking but at least explicable, a young man's greed outrunning his judgment. Talbot was different. He was the person everyone at Colby Custom Coach had trusted precisely because he was supposed to be the outside check on exactly this kind of thing, the professional whose entire value depended on not being compromised. I heard secondhand from Inez, a few days later, that several longtime employees had spent a lunch break simply sitting in stunned silence once word got around, the way people sit together after news that reorganizes something they thought was permanently settled. Raymond had trusted Talbot publicly, Visibly, for decades introduced him at company events, brought him into major negotiations, treated his counsel as close to unquestionable. Watching that trust unravel, even secondhand, seemed to shake people on that floor in a way neither Denise's nor Colt's failures fully had. My mother called me the evening it became official, her voice smaller than I had heard it in months, all the careful composure gone from it entirely. "Is it true?" she asked. "About Warren." "It's true," I said. "There's a recording," he confirmed it himself. In front of Grant. In front of his own attorney. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "I trusted him more than I trusted almost anyone outside this family," she said finally. "When things got difficult with Colt, when I didn't know what to do, he was the one who told me it would be fine, that he'd help me manage it. I believed him because he'd never given me a reason not to. For 30 years, I didn't say anything right away." There was something almost disorienting about hearing my mother sound this uncertain, this genuinely shaken, after months of watching her recalculate every position with the same brisk, defensive control she'd used since I was a child, the same voice she used to close a difficult client meeting or smooth over an awkward moment at a family gathering. I hadn't realized, until that silence stretched out between us, how much of my image of her had been built entirely on that composure, and how strange it felt to hear it finally crack open in front of me instead of around me. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice catching slightly in a way I'd never once heard from her before. "I didn't know how far he'd let this go. I knew Colt had problems with a vendor. I convinced myself it was smaller than it was, because believing that was easier than the alternative. But I never asked Warren to lie to Raymond for me. I never asked him to draft anything, whatever he did on his own. That was his choice, not mine." "I believe you," I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I meant it, not because she'd earned back the full weight of my trust in a single phone call, but because the shape of what she was describing matched everything I'd already seen in the evidence myself. We sat in silence together for a moment. Two people on either end of a phone line, neither one quite sure what came next in a conversation that had never once, in my entire life, sounded like this before. I could hear her breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone working very hard to hold herself together without the usual tools she reached for automatically. "I don't know what to do with any of this," she admitted finally. "I've spent so long assuming I understood everyone around me. Turns out I understood almost none of it." "Neither did I said. "Not until Raymond started teaching me how to look." She let out something that wasn't quite a laugh, quiet and worn. "He always did see things the rest of us missed. I used to resent that about him, when we were young. I think I resented it in you too, if I'm honest. It's easier to be angry at someone for noticing things than to ask yourself why you never bothered to. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that my mother had said something to me that didn't sound like a performance calibrated for whoever might be listening. I told her I needed to go, and she let me, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, neither of us hung up the phone feeling like we'd lost something to the other. I sat at my own kitchen table for a long while after that call ended, turning the conversation over the way I turned over everything now, looking for the seam where her sincerity might give way to strategy. I didn't find one. Not that night. Maybe there would be more of this to untangle later, more contradictions to weigh against each other before I could trust the shift I'd just heard in her voice. But for one evening, at least, I let myself simply sit with the fact that my mother had sounded, for the first time in my adult life, like someone still capable of being surprised by her own blind spots rather than defending them on instinct. The final settlements took another 6 weeks to complete, longer than any of us expected, though Whitfield had warned me from the beginning that resolving 3 separate situations properly, each with its own attorneys and its own timeline, would take considerably longer than exposing them had. Colt's came first, though not before one final attempt to negotiate directly with me instead of through counsel. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, the way our mother had months earlier, though he didn't bring a folder. He just stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking younger and less certain than I'd seen him look in years. "There's got to be a version of this where I keep some piece of the company," he said. "Even a small piece. I built relationships there for over a decade. That has to count for something." "It counted for something when the relationships were real," I said. "Marisol Vance built a relationship there too. Colt, you priced her out of it and replaced her with a kickback scheme run through your college roommate. I don't know what version of fair you're asking me for." He didn't have an answer to that. He stood there a moment longer, like he was waiting for the conversation to soften on its own, if he simply outlasted the silence. The way it always had at every dinner table growing up. It didn't soften. Eventually he left without saying anything else, and once Marisol's statement, Priya's financial tracing, and Talbot's own confession sat together in the same file. His attorney advised him there was little left to negotiate through any channel. He agreed to repay the traced amount from CJD Holdings in full, resign immediately from Colby Custom Coach, and formally relinquish any future claim to management authority tied to Raymond's shares, regardless of how his inheritance distribution was ultimately calculated. He didn't attend the final signing in person. He sent his attorney instead, and left the building, as far as I know, without saying goodbye to anyone still working there. Denise's resolution looked different, shaped by the fact that the evidence, however damning, had never shown personal enrichment on her part, only concealment and a repeated failure to ask the questions her position required her to ask. She agreed to resign permanently from any financial or approval authority at the company, cooperate fully with the remainder of the review, and accept a formal written finding describing her conduct honestly rather than charitably. She wasn't branded a thief. The evidence didn't support that, but the finding didn't spare her either, and to her credit, she didn't ask it to. She signed the paperwork in Whitfield's office on a quiet Tuesday morning, no attorney arguing on her behalf this time, and told him afterward, according to what he later relayed to me, that she'd rather have an accurate record than a flattering one for the first time in longer than she could remember choosing that particular trade-off. Talbot's situation moved slowest, tangled up in bar association procedures and a still pending decision about criminal referral that Whitfield told me could take months longer to resolve fully. He was removed from every advisory capacity connected to the company immediately, and the fabricated trust amendment was formally voided by the court, its existence entered into the record as exactly what it was. I heard second-hand through Whitfield that he'd quietly stepped back from several other long-standing client relationships in the weeks following his removal, though whether that was a genuine reckoning or simply damage control, none of us could say for certain, and I found I didn't have much appetite left to keep wondering about it. I sat in Whitfield's office the day the last of the immediate paperwork was finalized, looking at a folder considerably thicker than the one that had held Raymond's original letter all those months earlier, thick enough now to require its own dedicated drawer in his filing cabinet. "It's strange," I said, turning the finished paperwork over once in my hands before setting it back down. "None of this feels like winning exactly." "It rarely does," Whitfield said. "Not when it's family. I've handled dozens of these situations over the years, and the ones that involve genuine wrongdoing almost never end with anyone feeling triumphant. They end with things simply becoming accurate again, after a long period of not being accurate. That's usually the best outcome available." "Accurate," I repeated, testing the word the way I might test a figure that finally balanced after weeks of not adding up. "That's a strange word for it." "It's the only word I trust," he said. "Justice implies a kind of closure this rarely provides, Accuracy is more honest about what actually happened here. The record now reflects what actually occurred, instead of what certain people needed everyone else to believe occurred. That's not nothing. Nora, even if it doesn't feel like a victory lap. I sat with his answer a while longer than the moment strictly required, the two of us letting the quiet in that office do most of the remaining work. Then I thought about it further on the drive home, turning the word over the way I turned over everything now. Accurate, not healed, not resolved, not even close to fully forgiven in most cases. Just, finally, accurate. It wasn't the triumphant ending some part of me might have imagined. Months earlier, sitting in a hallway waiting to be let back into a room. But it was. I was starting to understand. Exactly the kind of ending Raymond had actually built this whole structure to deliver. My father asked me to meet him at the plant again, the same way he had all those months earlier, though this time he didn't sound hesitant on the phone. He sounded, if anything, like a man who'd finally decided something and wanted to say it out loud before he lost his nerve. I found him in the same spot near the paint booth, the plant quiet around us in the same late afternoon lull. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee this time, one for each of us, and handed me mine without ceremony. "I wanted to say some things properly," he said, instead of letting them slip out sideways in a parking lot the way the last one did. I smiled. Despite everything, remembering Ridgeline's name tumbling out of him almost against his will. I appreciated the sideways version too. He didn't smile back, not right away, and I noticed the coffee in his hand had already gone lukewarm, like he'd been standing there working up to this conversation longer than he was letting on. He looked instead at the row of half-finished coach frames stretching down the assembly line. The same view he'd looked at the last time we'd stood here together. I spent 30 years telling myself that staying quiet was the same thing as keeping this family together, he said. I watched your mother make decisions I didn't agree with, and I told myself objecting wasn't worth the fight it would start. I watched Colt get away with things 100 times smaller than what we found out about, and I told myself boys that age just need time to grow into responsibility. I watched you get overlooked, dinner after dinner, year after year, and I told myself it wasn't my place to referee my wife and my children. Dad, let me finish, he said gently. I need to say this all the way through, or I'm not sure I'll manage it at all. He turned to look at me directly. None of that silence kept the peace. Nora, I understand that now. It just meant the unfairness had somewhere quiet to keep growing, undisturbed, because nobody with the standing to stop it ever did. I had that standing. I chose comfort instead, for longer than I want to admit. I didn't say anything. I let him keep going because it felt like exactly what he needed. Someone willing to simply receive it without rushing to make it easier for him. It occurred to me, standing there, that this might be the longest, uninterrupted thing my father had ever said to me in my entire life, and that the length of it mattered almost as much as the content. After decades of him choosing brevity over honesty whenever the two came into conflict, I didn't take any money, he said. I want you to know that clearly, because I know how it might have looked from the outside. But I signed things I never reviewed, because your mother told me they were urgent, and I never once asked myself why urgent kept happening so often, or why she needed my signature instead of simply making the decision herself if it was really that routine. That's its own kind of failure. Maybe a quieter one than Colt's or Warren's, but a real one all the same. I know, I said. I read the transaction logs, Dad. I know exactly what you did and didn't do. I said it plainly, without the edge it might have carried a few months earlier, because by then I'd already spent so many evenings sorting fact from excuse that I no longer needed to punish him for the difference. I just needed him to keep naming it accurately, out loud, the way he was doing now. He nodded slowly, like that honesty was somehow easier to accept than comfort would have been. I'm proud of how you handled all of this, he said. Not because it turned out well for the company, though I'm grateful it did, because you never once did what the rest of us did. You never looked away from something just because looking at it honestly was going to be uncomfortable. We stood there together for a while after that, not saying much else. The assembly line stretching out silent and half-built in front of us, exactly the way it had the first time he'd tried, imperfectly, to say something true to me in this same spot. "Your uncle used to say something about you," he added eventually, quieter now, almost to himself. "Said you were the only one of us who ever double-checked the thing everybody else assumed was already settled. I used to think that was just Raymond being fond of you. I understand now he meant it as an actual description of how you're built. I wish I'd told you that myself, years ago, instead of leaving it for him to notice first." I felt something tighten in my throat, hearing that. A feeling closer to grief than to comfort, though the two had started to feel less separable to me than they used to. "You're telling me now," I said. "That still counts for something." "I hope so," he said. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, he reached over and pulled me into an actual embrace, brief and slightly awkward, the gesture of a man relearning something he'd let go unused for far too long. We stood there a moment longer than either of us was probably fully comfortable with, and neither of us pulled away first. The full 12-month review period ended on a Thursday, unremarkably, without any ceremony beyond a final report. Priya's office submitted to the independent board and to Whitfield's firm simultaneously. I read through the summary alone at my kitchen table one evening, the same table where I'd once found Raymond's notebook, the same table where my mother had once slid a settlement offer across toward me in a manila folder. The findings, in the end, were almost anticlimactic in their thoroughness. Every dollar traced, every account reconciled, every disputed vendor relationship either resolved through repayment or formally severed. The board's final assessment noted that Colby Custom Coach was, if anything, in stronger financial health than it had been at the start of the review. Once the improperly documented discretionary spending had been eliminated and proper procurement controls put in place across every division, operating margins had actually improved slightly over the 12 months, a fact my mother, I was told, found difficult to hear without visible discomfort, given how many years she'd insisted the business could only function smoothly if certain people were simply trusted without question. The board added an independent oversight seat permanently to its structure, along with a strengthened anonymous reporting procedure and a mandatory secondary review requirement for any vendor relationship exceeding a certain threshold. Those changes, more than anything else that happened during that year, felt like the truest tribute to what Raymond had actually built this whole process to accomplish. Not punishment, not even accountability for its own sake. A system that no longer depended entirely on any single person's trustworthiness to function honestly. Whitfield called me a few days before the review's official close to discuss what came next for my own role. "You're not obligated to continue in any capacity once the trust's initial term ends," he said. "The board would welcome you in an ongoing advisory position if you wanted it. Several members have mentioned it directly. You'd be well within your rights to decline entirely and return to whatever life looks like without any of this attached to it." I thought about the conversation for several days afterward, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over every significant decision this past year slowly, deliberately, checking it against what I actually wanted, rather than what anyone watching might expect me to want. Part of me understood, by then, that I could have built an entirely different life out of the last 12 months if I'd wanted to: a title, a corner office, the kind of authority nobody in my family would have dared question again. I found, turning the option over honestly, that none of it actually appealed to me the way I might have expected it to. Months earlier, sitting in a hallway waiting to be let back into a room, I told Whitfield I'd accept a limited permanent seat on the Governance Oversight Committee, enough to make sure the structural changes stayed protected long after the formal review ended, Nothing more. No title beyond what that specific responsibility actually required. I kept my job at the food distribution center. My co-workers there had no idea, most of them, about any of what had happened over the past year. And I found I preferred it that way. At least for now, a life where I was simply Nora, the woman who caught discrepancies in shipping manifests, rather than the trustee who'd taken down half her own family. On the day the review formally closed, I drove out to the plant one last time in that specific capacity, walked the assembly floor the way Raymond used to, and stopped for a while near the paint booth where my father and I had finally said the things to each other that mattered. Inez found me there, and we didn't say much, just stood together for a few minutes, watching the ordinary rhythm of a company still building things, still standing, exactly the way its founder had wanted it to. The review's formal closing date happened to fall only a few days before the first anniversary of Raymond's death. A coincidence nobody had planned, but that felt, walking through it, entirely fitting. Whitfield called me on the anniversary itself, asking if I could come by his office one final time. His office looked the same as it always had, same long table, same careful stacks of folders, and yet somehow the room felt different to me now, less like a place where difficult news arrived, and more like a place where a long story was finally, quietly, arriving at its last page. "There's one more envelope," he said, when I arrived. "Your uncle instructed me to hold it until the trust's initial review period had fully concluded, regardless of how long that took. He was very specific about the timing. Not before. Not a day later than necessary either." He handed it to me across the same table where I'd first learned I was allowed to stay in a room I'd almost been kept out of. The envelope was thinner than the first one had been, just a single folded page inside, and I didn't open it there in his office. I asked if I could take it home first, and he told me, gently, that Raymond had actually anticipated I might ask exactly that, and had left a note saying it was entirely my choice where and when I finally read it. I drove home with it sitting on the passenger seat beside me, unopened, the whole way, glancing at it at every stoplight, the way you glance at something you're not quite ready for yet, but can't stop yourself from checking is still there. I waited until I was home, sitting at the same kitchen table where this entire year had quietly rearranged itself, before I opened the envelope. Raymond's handwriting filled a single page, steadier than I would have expected from a man that close to the end of his life. Each line written with the same careful, unhurried certainty he'd brought to every Sunday afternoon we'd ever spent together. "Nora, if you're reading this, then the review has run its full course, and I imagine you've heard, by now, more than one version of what I supposedly meant by all of it. I want to tell you myself, in my own words, one last time. I didn't build this because I stopped trusting my family. I built it because I'd watched, for too many years, how easily trust gets mistaken for permission. Your mother kept the peace by deciding whose voice counted in that company. Your father kept the peace by never asking the question that might have disturbed it. I understand now that keeping the peace that way doesn't actually create peace at all. It creates a kind of permission, quiet, unspoken, renewed every time nobody objects for unfairness to keep doing exactly what it's always done. I didn't want to leave you power, Nora. Power was never the gift. I wanted to leave you the one thing I'd watched you already have, long before any of this started, and never once saw anyone else in this family properly value. You notice what's actually true, even when noticing it costs you something. I built a structure that depended on that specific gift, because it was the only thing in this whole story I ever fully trusted. Don't mistake what happened this year for triumph over your mother, or your brother, or Warren. It wasn't that, and I hope you never let anyone convince you it needs to be framed that way for it to have mattered. What happened this year was simpler than triumph. Things that were true finally got to be said out loud, in a room where everyone had to listen, instead of staying buried under whatever version of the story was more comfortable for the people who benefited from it staying buried. I'm proud of the woman who caught a duplicated VIN number on a Sunday afternoon and didn't know yet what it would eventually cost her, or give her. I was proud of her a long time before she had any reason to know it. Take care of yourself now, not the company, not the family's opinion of you. Yourself. Love, Raymond. I read the letter a second time, slower, letting each sentence sit before moving to the next one. The way I imagined he must have written it, sentence by sentence, knowing it would be the last thing he ever said to me, and wanting to get every word of it right. I sat with the letter for a long time after I finished reading it, longer than I'd sat with almost anything else that entire year. I thought about his notebook sitting on the shelf beside me, the one with his careful confirmed written next to my answers. 18 months before either of us understood what it was building toward. I thought about the old phone recorder in that dusty back room, humming quietly to itself for years, waiting for exactly the moment it eventually served. Every piece of this story. I understood now, sitting alone at my kitchen table with his handwriting in front of me, had been part of the same singular, patient design, a man who trusted paper and time more than he trusted anyone's promise. Building something that could survive without ever needing to trust the wrong person twice. I thought about my mother, learning for the first time in her adult life what it felt like to be surprised by her own blind spots instead of defending them. I thought about my father, finally saying out loud the things his silence had cost all of us for 30 years. I thought about Colt, gone now to some other city, some other sales floor, presumably still telling some version of this story where he was the one who'd been wronged. I thought about Warren Talbot, sitting somewhere tonight with a career he'd spent 40 years building, now permanently altered by 2 hours of a recorded phone call he'd never once imagined anyone would hear. I thought, too, about Inez Calder, still walking that assembly floor, still quietly watching who deserved trust and who didn't, the way she'd watched it for over 20 years before I ever thought to ask her opinion. I thought about Marisol Vance, finally paid what she was owed, finally heard by someone with the authority to write it down. I thought about the 4 laid-off employees she'd mentioned once, over a diner coffee she never finished, and hoped, without any way of knowing for certain, that some accounting existed somewhere for what they'd lost too, even if it never made it into any file I'd ever see. I didn't feel triumphant, thinking about any of them. I never really had, not once, across this entire year. What I felt instead, reading my uncle's last words to me at my own kitchen table, was something quieter and more durable than triumph. Something closer to having finally arrived somewhere I hadn't fully realized I'd been walking toward my whole life, a version of myself, who no longer needed anyone else's permission to trust what I could clearly see in front of me. Money could have bought comfort, if I'd taken my mother's offer that first week. A title could have bought status, if I'd accepted the board's advisory seat with every bell and whistle attached to it. A polished version of this story, told the family's preferred way, could have persuaded a room full of relatives for years to come. None of those things, I understood now, could have ever replaced what actually mattered. Accuracy, accountability, the specific unglamorous courage of refusing to look away from something just because looking at it honestly was inconvenient for everyone around you. My mother had once tried to leave me standing in a hallway, certain I had no place in whatever the family was deciding that morning. A year later, she had no authority left inside the company that decision was meant to protect. My brother had no position there at all. And the woman they'd once called Clipboard Nora, without ever once imagining she was listening closely enough to remember it, was the one who'd ended up legally responsible for making sure nobody in that family could hide from the truth again. I never celebrated any of their losses. I didn't need to. The only victory that ever actually mattered was simpler than that, and quieter than anyone watching from the outside might expect. Nobody could put me back in that hallway. Not my mother, not my brother, not a room full of relatives who preferred the comfortable version of our family's story to the accurate one. And if someone spent 20 years treating you like you didn't matter, then suddenly needed you the moment the truth finally came looking for them, would you hand them another chance without asking a single question first? Or would you finally let their own choices tell you everything you actually needed to know?